Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business today is a Stage 1 debate on motion number 6294 in the name of John Swinney on the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Scotland Bill. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I now call on Cabinet Secretary John Swinney to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, 14 minutes or thereby, please.
Presiding Officer, the Scotland Act 2012 devolves responsibility for taxes on land and property transactions and disposal to landfill to this Parliament from April 2015. The bill sets out the provisions and rules for a land and buildings transaction tax that will replace stamp duty land tax in Scotland from April of 2015. In my statement to Parliament last June, I set out the approach the Government intends to take on the new taxation responsibilities that have been passed to the Parliament. The proposals are firmly founded on Scottish principles that still hold good today. In his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776, Adam Smith set out 4 maxims with regard to taxes. The burden should be proportionate to the ability to pay, there should be certainty, there should be convenience, and there should be efficiency of collection. These principles provide the bedrock for us to build a system that will meet the needs of a modern 21st century Scotland. To those 4 principles, this Government adds our core purpose of delivering sustainable economic growth for Scotland. In assessing the proposals that we have in front of us today, I'd like to consider, Presiding Officer, the 4 principles that I have set out. The Government has sought to use what responsibility we have on taxation to ensure that no one is asked to pay more than they can legitimately afford to pay in relation to tax provisions. The Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill signals a move away from the UK Government's slab tax approach to stamp duty land tax, which distorts the market. Instead, we are proposing a progressive system of taxation where the amount paid is more closely related to the value of the property and therefore, by virtue, to the ability of the individual to pay. This approach has been warmly welcomed by tax professionals and others during the public consultation process for the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill. The second principle is in relation to the provision of certainty, and we consider that it is important to provide certainty about when and how much tax is due, and that this is an important guiding principle for our new system. The consultation period on the LBTT bill has been extremely helpful and productive, and we will continue to engage with taxpayers and professionals to provide certainty and to ensure that tax changes have been properly thought through and communicated before being introduced. Even where we are required to move swiftly to tackle threats of tax evasion or avoidance, we will, wherever possible, seek to provide information and clarity about our intentions in so doing. One of the opportunities before us is to create a simple and administratively efficient tax collection system. We will ensure that it is easy to fulfil the obligations of a citizen in Scotland to pay taxes. We envisage a system that is simple to operate and digital first. We will develop appropriate IT systems to ensure that information about Scottish taxes and ways to pay them are easily accessible to all, in line with our broader objectives, while of course respecting the fact that some taxpayers will continue to want to use non-digital methods. And then the fourth of the principles is in relation to the need for the tax system to be efficient. It is clear that tax revenues must be devoted taxes and revenues must be devoted to paying for public services and not consumed in tax administration. Scotland will benchmark itself against international standards to ensure that administration costs are kept to a minimum. Our approach to Our approach to tax collection is right for Scotland, and it will be the most cost-efficient way for Scotland. I'll give way to Mary Scanlon.
I thank the Finance Secretary. As a member of the Audit Committee, we've obviously been looking into the Auditor-General's report into the IT systems of the registers for Scotland, and I notice, Presiding Officer, it is also mentioned in paragraph 60, particular concern to witnesses was the readiness and effectiveness of Ross's IT system. Can I just ask for an assurance from the Finance Secretary that difficulties have been overcome and they are ready for this?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, I would describe it as work in progress to Mary Scanlon, and Registers of Scotland, as I set out to Parliament last June, will be the collection organisation for the new tax. They are, of course, involved in the collection of a large amount of existing fees in relation to property transactions as part of their routine, rudimentary role in relation to their functions. So this essentially is a bolt-on to the existing responsibilities of Registers of Scotland. But the project board that supervises the implementation of these proposals is acutely monitoring the very important issues that Mary Scanlon fairly raises in the debate. And as we proceed towards implementation in April 2015, I will continue to keep Parliament updated about the progress that is being made, because I do recognise it as a very important consideration in the establishment of effective IT systems in that respect. Presiding Officer, as I explained in the Chamber last June, and as I have just repeated to Mary Scanlon, we would establish Revenue Scotland to assess and collect devolved taxes. By 2015, in line with international best practice, Revenue Scotland will be operationally independent, working alongside Registers of Scotland in relation to this tax provision and alongside SEPA in relation to the landfill tax that we will introduce into the bargain. The approach that we will take to establishing a new Scottish Tax Authority has been widely welcomed, and we will continue to update Parliament on the steps being taken to implement the arrangements around Revenue Scotland. As we made clear in presenting our programme for government last September, we have a programme of legislation to put in place the two taxes devolved in the Scotland Act. Following the LBTT bill, a second bill making provision for a Scottish landfill tax was introduced to Parliament on the 17th of April. We propose a third measure for next year's legislative programme dealing with tax management. The public consultation on proposals for a tax management bill closed on the 12th of April, and we propose to introduce the bill in the autumn. It will establish Revenue Scotland on a statutory basis and set out the underpinning arrangements required to support both devolved taxes. These bills are the first important steps to establishing the principle that taxes paid in Scotland are best set, managed and collected here by those with Scotland's interests at heart. The LBTT bill has been developed with two key objectives in mind. Firstly, we have sought to simplify the legislation in terms of both its content and its structure. Over the past decade, stamp duty land tax has suffered from additional layers of new legislation year on year, and taxpayers and their advisers often find its complexity difficult to understand and navigate. By contrast, the LBTT bill has a clear structure, tax reliefs have been rationalised and grouped logically together, and the provisions of the bill are clearly set out. As I mentioned earlier, we are moving away from the slab rates of stamp duty land tax, which distorts the property market, particularly for housing, and may encourage taxpayers to record false prices, for example by overvaluing movable items included in a sale in order to pay tax in a lower tax band. Instead, we are proposing a progressive system of taxation where the amount paid is more closely related to the value of the property and therefore to the ability of the individual to pay. This approach has been widely welcomed. The scenarios in our consultation paper launched last June also indicated a willingness to adjust the tax thresholds in order to support first-time buyers and those at the lower end of the market. To demonstrate the difference that a progressive approach can bring for those purchasing residential property in Scotland, the consultation paper illustrated two revenue-neutral scenarios. The first would remove the tax charge for all house purchases below £180,000, significantly benefiting first-time buyers. The second would have the effect that anyone purchasing properties under £325,000 would pay less tax, bringing benefits to around 95% of the property market. Those purchasing property at higher values would, of course, pay more. To further simplify the operation of the tax, the anti-avoidance provisions of Section 75A of the Finance Act 2003 for stamp duty land tax, which experienced tax practitioners find hard to understand, have not been replicated in this bill. Tax practitioners have welcomed our intention to bring forward a general anti-avoidance rule in the tax management bill that will come to Parliament in due course. A second objective in developing the bill was to bring the provisions into line with Scots law and practice. We see it as essential that taxpayers and expert communities should have an integral role in ensuring our approach to taxation is and remains fit for purpose. The work undertaken by Bill team officials with an expert working group on non-residential leases well illustrates this collaborative approach. Input from the expert group will ensure that the tax treatment of non-residential leases in Scotland will be firmly grounded in Scots law and practices. Under the current SDLT system, English property law effectively applies, and that creates some confusion and conflict with the existing statute of Scots law. Having met with members of the working group, I have concluded that the tax payable on non-residential leases will be based on the net present value approach, with a recalculation of the tax due at 3 yearly review periods based on the actual rent paid in the period. A taxpayer will also be required to submit a return at the end of the lease. The expert non-residential leases working group is continuing to work with the Bill team to devise the detailed rules of this new approach to taxing non-residential leases, and I am grateful to them for their continuing input. Turning now to the Finance Committee's report, I readily acknowledge the wide-ranging and penetrating debate on a wide range of issues that has taken place during the Stage 1 evidence sessions taken forward by the Finance Committee. I am delighted that the committee has supported the general principles of the bill, and yesterday I wrote to the convener of the committee responding to the various issues that were raised in the committee's report. I want to comment briefly here on some of the key issues covered in the report and my response. As the policy memorandum for the bill explains, my initial thinking was to set out the tax rates and bands that would apply from April 2015 in respect of land and buildings transaction tax at the time of the draft budget in September 2014. The committee recognised in its report that there was a range of views amongst witnesses about when to publish tax rates and bands, ranging from a week before the introduction of the tax to 2 years prior to introduction. I have yet to reach a firm conclusion on this matter, but I would say to Parliament that it is not my intention to announce rates and bands any earlier than September 2014. In light of the views expressed, I will consider carefully whether to wait until nearer April 2015 to do so. The existing stamp duty land tax rules for relieving so-called sub-sales are acknowledged to provide opportunities for aggressive tax avoidance activity. Tax avoiders have employed a range of schemes to construct land transactions in a way that means no tax is paid at all. I am clear that responsible taxpayers do not welcome these attempts to shift the legitimate burden of taxation. I have made clear to Parliament on a number of occasions that we will take a rigorous approach to dealing with tax avoidance. In the UK budget in March 2012, the Chancellor of the Exchequer committed to consulting on legislation to narrow the sub-sale relief rules and reduce the scope for avoidance. This consultation took place, and the reformed sub-sale rules are currently making their way through Westminster in the Finance Bill 2013. However, I believe it is necessary to go further than this. I do not intend to replicate in taxes that are devolved to Scotland those rules and reliefs that have led to avoidance activity. I therefore introduced the LBTT bill without any form of sub-sale relief. I welcome the Finance Committee's support for the removal of sub-sale relief. Having considered the committee's report carefully, I do not intend to bring forward amendments that open the way for any form of sub-sale relief. To do so opens up significant risk of giving scope to tax avoiders who are intent on reducing their tax burden through artificial schemes that are not envisaged by this Parliament as meriting relief. Members of the Finance Committee have heard, however, evidence from some stakeholders who have stated the case for a targeted form of relief for a class of property transactions that are referred to as forward funding arrangements. I am giving careful consideration to these arguments, which I believe have been put forward with the best of intentions. My question is whether these transactions relief under giving these transactions relief under LBTT will not open the door to the sort of tax avoidance activity that has been a negative feature of stamp duty land tax to date. I am committed to the creation of a tax environment that is supportive of economic activity in Scotland. I wish to ensure that widely accepted development transactions of the kind described to the Finance Committee can continue without an undue tax burden. The property development industry plays a vital role in supporting economic growth and regeneration. Therefore, we are undertaking further work with stakeholders to ensure that in a forward funding arrangement, the parties can achieve a fair outcome under LBTT. Charities relief has also been the subject of some discussion at the committee's Stage 1 evidence sessions. Concerns have been expressed by some stakeholders at the requirement for charitable organisations who invest in but do not occupy property in Scotland, and those who use the associated income stream for charitable purposes, to register with the Office of the Scottish Charities Regulator to obtain this relief. I firmly believe that in order to protect the tax base, it is vital to have systems in place to ensure that any relief, not just charities relief, fully satisfies rigorous eligibility criteria. Officials are discussing with Revenue Scotland and Oscar an alternative approach for the small number of cases affected each year. I am confident that we will have the legal and administrative systems in place, Presiding Officer, in good time to collect a fair and robust land and buildings transaction tax in Scotland from April 2015. I have covered in this contribution the approach the Government is taking to the formation of the legislation and to the issues that have been raised in the Finance Committee, and I look forward to considering with colleagues this afternoon the issues that are raised as a consequence of this debate. And I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. Now call on Kenneth Gibson to speak on behalf of the Finance Committee. 10 minutes, please, Mr Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to highlight key areas the Finance Committee considered following our Stage 1 evidence-taking. The Scotland Act 2012 devolves a range of taxation and borrowing measures, powers to borrow for capital projects, set a Scottish rate of income tax to replace a 10p in the pound income tax reduction for Scottish taxpayers across all bands, and powers to set a tax on land transactions and disposals to landfill. The landfill tax bill was introduced last week, while the tax management bill will be introduced later this year. The bill provides for the rules and structure of LBTT to levy a tax on anyone buying, leasing or taking rights such as options to buy over land and property. It covers both residential and non-residential transactions, including the purchase, lease or licence of options over commercial properties such as shops, offices, factories, land for development and agricultural or forestry land. Our report identifies issues that emerged from evidence given. I will first highlight tax bands and rates. The Scottish Government will replace the slab structure, as Mr Swinney has indicated, of stamp duty land tax, a tax to be disapplied under the Scotland Act 2012, with a progressive structure to include a nil rate band and at least two others. Witnesses supported this approach. For example, the Edinburgh Solicitors Property Centre is, and I quote, fully supportive of LBTT being a progressive tax, while the Council of Mortgage Lenders Scotland said, while there would be winners and losers of any new system, we believe a progressive system would be more equitable and overcome some of the inefficiencies created by the slab system. The Bill team comments that considerations ministers will take into account include the expected amount of revenue to be raised and the volatility of receipts from stamp duty land tax in Scotland over the past few years will be a factor in ministers' consideration of how to set rates and thresholds. The committee supports the introduction of a progressive structure. Some witnesses expressed concerns about when the level of LBTT would be known prior to its introduction on 1 April 2015, and this is particularly relevant in respect of commercial property transactions, where some argued there could be a risk of discouraging investment. Our report highlights the Cabinet Secretary's view that he is not persuaded of the need to provide too much advance notice, and next year's draft budget may even be too early, as indeed he indicated a few minutes ago. We recognise the range of views on the timing of rates and bans and ask the Scottish Government to consider likely implications for the commercial property market. Regarding scrutiny of the proposed bans and rates, the Subordinate Legislation Committee's view is that if the affirmative procedure is required for initial use of this power, it can see no reason why it should not require that level of scrutiny thereafter. It also identifies a procedural option available should there be a need to act quickly in response to changing market conditions. I note the Cabinet Secretary intends to bring forward Stage 2 amendments to provide a form of provisional affirmative procedure after the first occasion bans and rates are set. In its consultation on the Tax Management Bill covering issues applicable to each tax, such as collection, use of information, penalties for late payment and tax evasion, the Scottish Government states that SDLT has been subject to sustained and aggressive tax avoidance. There is a risk that LBTT could be subject to similar activity. And all transactions involving land or buildings in Scotland should be liable for LBTT, except in certain limited and specific circumstances set out in legislation. The Cabinet Secretary wants to take, and we've heard this afternoon him repeat this, a vigorous approach to tax avoidance and will use two different types of anti-avoidance rules, which Witness has broadly supported: an effective general anti-avoidance rule in the Tax Management Bill and targeted anti-avoidance rules in the LBTT Bill. The Bill team comments about the use of and exemptions from tax relief and how the Scottish Government has sought to minimise avoidance. We considered in detail the absence of subsidy relief in the Bill. The Scottish Government believes this acts, and I quote, as a gateway to a significant amount of avoidance activity. Some witnesses challenge this. Pinsent Maitland suggests there are numerous circumstances where an organisation might legitimately seek to acquire land and move it on quickly, and it should be entirely possible to develop subsidy relief provisions which protect tax revenues from unacceptable avoidance while retaining the economic benefits which the relief facilitates. Some witnesses suggested removal of subsidy relief would impact on forward funding arrangements where the three parties are involved in development of a property: the vendor, a property developer and an institutional investor. Brodie's argued that while subsidy relief has been used to avoid paying SDLT, it also facilitated development. And they said Scottish developers could face higher costs than the rest of the UK, and such proposals for higher taxation cannot be justified or supported. But the Scottish Government set out two reasons for excluding subsidy relief from the Bill. I quote, although we accept a piece of land can be bought and sold twice on the same day for perfectly legitimate commercial reasons, we were not persuaded there is an obvious case for relieving one of the set of transactions from tax. And subsidy relief has become an avenue for avoidance of quite substantial amounts of stamp duty land tax across the UK. We were anxious to limit opportunities for tax avoidance. The Cabinet Secretary said to committee that he had not come to a final decision on subsidy relief. Today they announced that he has indeed, as we have already heard. He also distinguished between subsidy relief and forward funding, expressing a desire to tackle tax avoidance without impacting adversely on economic growth, and the committee welcomes this distinction. The Cabinet Secretary is, and I quote, not minded to bring forward targeted relief, but my mind is not fixed on that, and I will wait until the committee reports in that respect. If subsidy relief was to be accommodated, ROS would have been prepared to build that functionality into this system and management. However, the committee supported the removal of subsidy relief from LBTT on the basis that any necessary amendments are brought forward at stage 2 to ensure forward funding or other legitimate arrangements are not subject to double taxation. The role of Revenue Scotland and Registers of Scotland are key to the efficient management and gathering of LBTT. Revenue Scotland, the tax authority for LBTT and the landfill tax, will be created as a non-ministerial department accountable to this Parliament rather than ministers. Its structure, functions, etc. will develop under the Tax Management Bill. Revenue Scotland's establishment was welcomed, as was the role of ROS in collecting LBTT. However, as the Bill team indicated, and I quote, resourcing is important and we are giving it a lot of thought. The Law Society stated it is essential that the new online system for LBTT is ready in sufficient time for it to be adequately tested by practitioners and for guidance to be prepared well before 2015. And I note in response to Mary Scanlon, the Cabinet Secretary said it is a work in progress. Concerns were expressed about the readiness and suitability of the IT infrastructure, including the automated registration of title to land system and its robustness, speed and ease of use, and the need to replace it with a fully operational system tested by external users as well as ROS. There is clearly a role for the Scottish Government in providing efficient oversight and management of this. The Cabinet Secretary is confident ROS will deliver the necessary IT infrastructure, and ROS believes funding is sufficient to design and build a new system, and there is sufficient contingency. Provision of information and guidance to taxpayers is made in the financial memorandum to cover costs relating to staffing, printing and communication, and a helpline. Defining roles and responsibilities is important in ensuring people know who to approach for advice and assistance. Well-trained specialist staff, in addition to full and accessible guidance, is crucial. Clarity in relation to compliance activity, with Revenue Scotland producing milestones and dates for key deliverables, is important. We will monitor and scrutinise the implementation and delivery of LBTT through progress reports from both bodies. With regard to transitional arrangements, costs will arise from work to enable systems to be switched off and for communications, including publicity and guidance. The Office for Budget Responsibility has responsibility for forecasting receipts for the Scottish rate of income tax, SDLT and landfill tax on a 6-monthly basis alongside its economic and fiscal outlook. It has provided forecasts for Scottish taxes to 2017-18 and specific forecasts for SDLT to 2016-17. The financial memorandum states, "It is reasonable to assume receipts from LBTT will be equivalent to those from SDLT at present, and the block grant adjustment will be broadly equal to the level of SDLT receipts." Homes for Scotland expressed concerns about the strength of the housing market and believes significant change is unlikely in the coming years. The Scottish Property Federation believes OBR forecast to be, and I quote, "wildly optimistic." It suggests the Scottish Government digs in its heels when negotiating the SDLT block grant adjustment with Her Majesty's Treasury. There will be a one-off reduction in the block grant. The Cabinet Secretary suggests that, given the volatility of SDLT receipts, the fairest and most reliable means of calculating the size of the reduction is to calculate a 5-year receipt average using actual rather than forecast data when calculating the adjustment, given the forward estimating of SDLT is very difficult. And OBR forecasts have already been significantly revised. The committee has taken evidence on the block grant adjustment, reporting before the end of May to help inform discussions on the Joint Exchequer Committee. Presiding Officer, the committee assessed and reflected carefully on the evidence and supports the general principles of the bill, and it now aims to closely monitor implementation and delivery of LBTT. I realise I haven't given the time allowed when talked about the issue of charities, but I know that other colleagues have raised this matter in committee extensively and will do so in following speeches. At stage 2, we will consider issues surrounding subsale relief, forward funding and non-residential leases. Given the very technical nature of expected amendments, we are keen to see these as early as possible in the stage 2 process, and we greatly appreciate the efforts of the Bill team and the Cabinet Secretary in this regard.
Thank you very much. I call Mr McIntosh. Ken McIntosh, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The land and building transaction tax is, I believe, Scotland's first new tax in 300 years. It stems from the conclusions of the Calman Commission established by Wendy Alexander and other party leaders, and it marks the first transfer of substantial fiscal power from Westminster to Holyrood under the terms of the Scotland Act 2012. The bill makes provision for a tax on land transactions in Scotland and is scheduled to replace the UK-wide stamp duty land tax from April 2015. Presiding Officer, can I make it clear from the outset that Scottish Labour broadly supports the principles of LBTT as outlined in the draft bill, and in fact we believe that the bill is an example of devolution working well. Presiding Officer, given the political contention surrounding the whole issue of tax-raising powers and devolution, of concern over rampant tax avoidance and worries over lack of support for the housing industry, what is worth remarking on is the level of cross-party political agreement that has been reached around this proposed legislation. The bill affords Scotland the opportunity to design a tax that suits our own needs. It redresses some of the flaws of the current taxation system, and it frees the Scottish housing market from the market distortions of London and the South East. And no one will be surprised to hear that Scottish Labour supports the principles of a progressive approach to taxation. We believe that replacing stamp duty's tiered or so-called slab structure with the LBTT's gradual rising scale or progressive approach is a welcome change to the existing tax system. The current slab taxation approach creates disincentives and marked inequities in the level of tax paid, particularly around the tax thresholds, where a difference in selling price of £1 can lead to an extra tax burden measured in thousands of pounds. Not only will changing to a progressive scale hopefully lead to a more equitable tax structure, it will help eliminate the market distortions around tax thresholds and simultaneously facilitate the sale of properties valued marginally above the thresholds. It should also mean that the value of tax applied to transactions will be more reflective of the total value of the property sold, and is therefore hoped that this will result in a more robust and competitive Scottish property market. It is worth commenting that, as well as reaching political agreement, witnesses from public, private and the voluntary sector all broadly supported the principles underpinning the LBTT. What is also worth highlighting, however, is that ministers have yet to indicate one of the most important issues of all, and that is, of course, what the new tax rates will be. We know that there will be a 0% band and at least 2 other higher bands. It's far from clear yet, though, when the Cabinet Secretary intends to make this information public. We are also led to expect that the tax take from the change from stamp duty to the LBTT will be broadly tax neutral, but that still leaves quite a deal of uncertainty. The CBI, amongst others, noted that a new Scottish system should take UK tax rates into account when setting banding levels, as any substantial difference between UK stamp duty and Scottish LBTT rates could have a direct effect on the attractiveness of Scotland as a place of work or to live or invest. Several witnesses raised concerns, and I think both the Cabinet Secretary and Mr Gibson, as convener of the committee, echoed this, at the important judgment to be made when announcing the new rates, and in particular their sensitivity at the length of time between the announcement and the actual implementation of the new tax. Many recognised that this period had to be short enough to prevent people from delaying or bringing forward transactions in a bid to game the system and therefore benefit from the time lag. Others suggested that this had to be weighed against the need to prevent uncertainty in the market. The Cabinet Secretary seemed to suggest in his evidence, and confirmed in fact this afternoon, that he may not announce the new banding levels even as late as his budget of September 2014. Presiding Officer, it could be, of course, that the Cabinet Secretary believes he will be too depressed in September 2014 to make any such decision. But I hope Mr Mason can demonstrate a sense of humour. Mr Mason.
I thank the member for giving way, but would he accept that if the overall indication is that it's going to be broadly tax neutral, in fact the room for manoeuvre in there is not huge, so it's not that unpredictable?
Indeed, and I was just going to go on to suggest that if the Cabinet Secretary will perhaps indicate to the committee and to Parliament when he actually has agreed on a date, so we can have some clarity in this matter, I think that would help. Now, every bit as important as the new taxation rates will be the agreement that is reached with Westminster on the consequent reduction in the block grant. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary will accept our assurances that we will support him in securing a good deal for Scotland. And I should emphasise that a good deal for Scotland is one that is fair and that is accepted by both sides as just. Basing agreements on figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility could be successful, and I would want to see an agreement as robust as that secured by the no detriment principle in the Calman Commission's other recommendations on tax. Presiding Officer, the Finance Committee was in full agreement with the Government that this new bill offers an opportunity to tackle the susceptibility of stamp duty to tax avoidance. And I know that the Cabinet Secretary and I have disagreed in the past over the Scottish Government's support for tax dodgers like Amazon, but I was very pleased to welcome and support the bill's general anti-avoidance rule. We hope this will minimise the exposure of LBTT and the forthcoming landfill tax to abusive tax arrangements, and we believe the rule should be robust and rigorously enforced. And on the subject of tax relief, we also support the bill's general approach, which is to do away with most, again with the hope that this will help prevent tax avoidance. There has been much discussion and lobbying on the removal of sub-sale relief, and I believe the committee has rightly highlighted concern of this matter, and I welcome the Minister's comments earlier and his statement in response to the committee that the Government will work with key stakeholders to ensure that forward funding arrangements are not subject to double taxation. I think above-board transactions should not be unnecessarily punished or stifled by the new tax system. Even more important will be that the Cabinet Secretary looks long and hard at what he can do to promote more energy-efficient homes. The fact that the zero-carbon homes relief has not been successfully applied for in Scotland does not merit government backsliding on the climate change cause. Measures to incentivise energy efficiency need to be re-explored, particularly if the Government is serious about making energy efficiency a more significant factor in home buyers' priorities, and if we are to cut carbon emissions by 42% as planned. And I wonder, certainly.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Mathews for giving me the point that I advanced at the committee on this question is that I wasn't persuaded by a relief in a property transaction whereby the purchaser of the property essentially got the benefit of investment that an individual householder had made in occupying that property. And I think the provisions that were inserted into the climate change legislation in relation to council tax was one helpful step. What we had to do was make sure those schemes were more widely available and taken up than they currently are taken. So there's no intention to in any way not give due attention to the issues of tackling carbon emissions. It is about finding the right mechanisms to do so.
Mr Macintosh.
I welcome the Minister's approach, and I say I do have sympathy for a scheme that wasn't applied for not renewing that. But can I draw the Minister's attention to a proposal that's been circulated in the last couple of days by the Association for the Conservation of Energy, and it's a proposal. It was actually prepared for the UK Green Buildings Council, proposing an energy efficiency modifier, which would be fiscally neutral, but could be applied to the LBTT relatively simply. And it's a proposal which has emerged since Mr Booth and Ms Watterson addressed the committee, and I would urge the Minister to give it some consideration, as it could offer the Government an opportunity to address this particular priority. Sorry, Mr Mackenzie.
Would you accept that, given the progressive nature of that tax, that would have the effect of helping those further up the ladder more? These are the people that least need help in making their homes more energy efficient. It's actually the people lower down the scale that do need the help.
It's an interesting point Mr Mackenzie raises about our desire as a country to reduce carbon emissions. And if carbon emissions on larger homes are greater, then we still need to put greater emphasis into reducing them. But it's an interesting dilemma. All I would urge at this stage is that the Minister and perhaps the committee members look at this proposal, as this bill does offer an opportunity to make progress on an issue which I don't think we're making much progress on. We're doing very well on new build houses, but we're not doing so well on retrofitting on existing homes, and I think it is an important matter. The Scottish Labour Party similarly welcomes the Charities and Charitable Trust Relief, which states that the LBTT will only offer tax relief to charities registered with the Office of the Scottish Charities Regulator, or OSCR. As with other measures, we wish to clamp down on potential abuse of the tax system. However, great care must be taken to make sure that legitimate charities are not excluded from relief. Regarding the administration of the tax, Scottish Labour notes that the Tax Management Bill proposes the creation of Revenue Scotland as a non-ministerial body for the care and management of devolved tax receipts. The bill also states that Registers of Scotland will also have a role in the collection of revenues, and we would echo the concern of witnesses that the division of duties between Revenue Scotland and the Registers is clearly defined, and that both organisations are appropriately staffed and resourced. And I would echo Mary Scanlon's comments earlier that particular focus should be targeted at the IT systems these two organisations will use for the delivery of LBTT. There is already widespread unease about the readiness and effectiveness of Registers of Scotland's IT system, as well as the current stamp duty online system, which has been described as overly complex. It is essential that adequate time and investment be directed into ensuring the systems are effectively designed, tested and proven fit for purpose. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour broadly supports the principles of LBTT as outlined in the draft bill. The bill is a clear indication that devolution is robust and effective, as it allows the Scottish Government the opportunity to design from scratch a new tax system which addresses many of the flaws in the existing stamp duty system. The new tax will be responsive to the markets in Scotland and will not be skewed by economic circumstances elsewhere in the UK. We await the two vital announcements on tax rates and the block grant, but we are happy to give our support to this new measure.
Thank you very much. I now call on Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll say in starting that the Scottish Conservatives will support the general principles of this bill, and obviously will vote for it come decision time today. Much of the bill and much of what the Cabinet Secretary had to say today is non-contentious, agreed by all sides, and I think I would particularly welcome the end of the slab structure in the Scottish Government's decision to get rid of that. It removes market distortions and the incentive for bunching that has taken place for quite some time under stamp duty land tax, and I know that it is a measure which has support not just among tax professionals, but I think more widely across the Scottish commercial and residential sector. There are three things I wanted to comment upon today more specifically, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I listened very carefully to the Cabinet Secretary's speech in relation to those three, and also to the Scottish Government's response to the committee report among those three. And I say that in one of those three I was positively encouraged by what the Cabinet Secretary had to say. One of them, I have to say, I was slightly discouraged by what he had to say, and the third one I was partially encouraged and partially discouraged by what he had to say. So let me begin on a very positive note. Then I was very encouraged, I have to say, by more than what he said in his report than what he said today in his speech in relation to licences. As matters stand, licences will be liable to LBTT, and I think there was a view on the committee at paragraph 54 that some categories of licence certainly should be exempted from the bill. That can't have been the policy objective or indeed the government's thinking at the time of drafting the bill. I think in particular the time element for licences is one factor to examine. It's not the only one, but there is surely a distinction between temporary short-term occupation and longer-term, more permanent occupation. I note the Scottish Government said that they've carefully considered the evidence presented to the committee and they intend to bring forward an amendment at stage 2 which sets out which licences are within the scope of the tax. I think that's welcome news, and I wonder if either later or in his closing speech today the Cabinet Secretary can confirm that that means a list of licences that would be covered will be included in the bill as opposed to a list of exemptions. And I wonder if at this stage he can share any more about the principles or his thinking in that regard. Happy to give way.
John Swinney.
I can confirm that the model will be that there will be an indication of the licences that will be included in scope. So essentially it will be specifying what licences will be covered rather than trying to establish a comprehensive list of all circumstances that are not covered, if that helps Parliament.
That is helpful, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think that's probably the right way to going about doing it. So I'm even more encouraged than I was to begin with on licences. Before we get too carried away, Deputy Presiding Officer, where I have to say I was discouraged, and I've expressed this on committee a number of times, the timing of the announcement about the bans and the rates for LBTT, I was not heartened about at all. The original plan was to announce in September 2014 for operation in April of 2015. This has led, from the evidence given to the committee, to some uncertainty within the business community. There is an absence of any indication of what those rates would be and what the actual bandings would be. And I do think what the Cabinet Secretary said, which is similar, I have to say, to what he said on committee, that there were a range of views over this from 1 week before to 2 years before, doesn't, I think, reflect what actually happened on the committee. And I would invite him to look very carefully again at the evidence given to the committee from the commercial sector. I accept his point about the residential sector. There was evidence there about 1 week before. But in terms of the commercial sector, almost every witness, without exception, stated that September 2014 was not giving the business and commercial sector enough time. Now, there was a range of views, but the range of views ranged between saying it should be a year and 18 months, or some time before September 2014. It wasn't a range of views saying it should be up until April 2015 and spread evenly. To me, I think it was very clear that the strong view of the business community, whether it's the Law Society, ICAS, the Scottish Building Federation and many, many others, was that it should be sooner than September 2014. And I think they will be discouraged by what the Cabinet Secretary said today in relation to that. The third item, Deputy Presiding Officer, with just a minute to go. Subsidy relief obviously took up a huge amount of time from the committee. It is an important part of the economy, but I do accept that in the past, and I'm sure currently, it does lead to tax avoidance, and the government has to strike a balance between the two. Nobody that gave evidence, as far as I can recall, said that it should be kept exactly as it is, but I think there was a strong view in the commercial sector that the wholesale removal was a bit of an overreaction and that there ought to be some exemptions. Now, I was encouraged by his comments on forward funding, and I hope that is taken forward with an amendment at stage 2. But I do think there are elements of subsale relief that are not forward funding that are still considered by many or most to be legitimate commercial transactions. And I ask him to look at this again to see if there are areas other than forward funding that could be protected via subsale relief without allowing subsale relief in its entirety as it currently stands, because I do accept that it does lead to a degree of tax avoidance. There's a balance to be struck, but I'm slightly concerned that, taken together, some of what we've heard today tips the balance slightly away from being competitive, and I hope that that can be revisited. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to the open debate. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. We're a bit tight for time, so up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Hepburn.
Thank you very much, President Officer, and let me welcome this Stage 1 debate. This bill is, of course, the first of three bills arising as a consequence of Scotland Act 2012, and let me say at the outset I look forward to scrutinising the other bills as they come to the Finance Committee. There are a number of changes proposed to the scope of stamp duty land tax as it is becoming LBTT within this bill that I very much welcome. I think the one that has been welcomed across the board has been the move from a slab structure of taxation to a progressive tax structure. I think that's been welcomed by just about everyone who has given evidence to the committee, because of course it bears greater relation to ability to pay, and it does deal with this issue of market distortion. Right now there is of course a huge disincentive for builders to build properties that are valued at around the margins, or properties to be put in the market at the value around the margins, and that of course will be removed with the new structure. I recognise there is a dialogue, there's an ongoing debate around about when the bans should be announced, the timings issue. I would just say I think we need to be very careful with that. Doing it either too late or too early could influence market behaviour, and I think we need to be very careful with that announcement. I think the Cabinet Secretary is right to be cautious in relation to that matter. There are also, of course, modifications to reliefs and exemptions, including withdrawal of subsale relief arrangements within this bill. That brought rather more mixed views, I will concede, when we got evidence at the committee, but I think on balance the bill has got it right, because clearly one of the drivers for this legislation is to reduce the amount of tax avoidance, and one of the parts of one of the areas that has, I think, allowed tax avoidance to arise has been the various reliefs that have been set out in the old tax regime. So I welcome these changes as well. I want to raise two issues in main, if I can, President Officer, if time allows. The first is a zero carbon homes relief or similar relief, and the second is charities relief. I started the process of assessing this bill quite sympathetic to the idea that there should be some form of relief to encourage environmental improvements in homes, and I know that there was evidence given by organisations out there in support of that, but I think we should bear in mind the point that was made by Homes for Scotland, that very few people actually go to buy their home with that uppermost in their mind, and certainly when I think of my own experience buying my own home, the energy efficiency of my home was not particularly uppermost in my mind at that time, and I take on board the point that has been made by the Cabinet Secretary. There may be other more appropriate ways to incentivise energy efficiency measures than through this bill. That said, if sensible measures are proposed, clearly the committee will consider them, but right now I think the bill on balance has it just about right. I want to turn to the issue of charities relief, which actually ultimately probably will affect very few transactions in any year, President Officer, but actually did take up some of our time in considering the bill at stage 1. I very much support the element of LBTT that offers relief for charities. I think organisations out there doing charitable work should be supported in this way, but it is clear, because essentially by including that, this will be the Scottish taxpayer subsidising charities, that we have to have the right mechanism by which charities can stand to benefit. And I know that Brodie's and ICAS made a suggestion that charities really should be available to those whose charitable status is granted by HMRC, but I have some concerns about that, notwithstanding I'm sure the good relationship that exists between the Scottish Government and HMRC. HMRC is not answerable either to this Parliament on a legislative basis or the Scottish Government on an executive basis, and I think for that reason Oscar is a far much more appropriate organisation by which charities should be registered to benefit by charitable relief. I know there was concern expressed by some that foreign
charities cannot register with Oscar, but we have had clear evidence that Section 14 of the Charities and Trustee Investment Scotland Act 2005 does allow for foreign charities to register with Oscar. And there was also concern expressed that this was some sort of onerous task for charities to have to go through. I have to say, if the provision exists now, it could be no more onerous for a charity to register for these purposes than it would be if they wanted to register with Oscar in the first place. And if a foreign charity, wants to get that essentially subsidy from the Scottish taxpayer, I think the least they can do is register as a charity. Let me conclude by focusing very briefly on the issue that was touched on by the convener of the committee, the issue of block grant adjustment. The block grant, of course, will be reduced on a one-off basis for LBTT. We absolutely have to get that right. I have to say to Mr McIntosh how fair the Treasury play in this matter might demonstrate how effective devolution is by comparison to other options available to Scotland. But I very much support the suggested methodology of the Scottish Government. Look forward to looking at that in future and the committee, President Officer, and also to stage 2 of this process.
Many thanks. Now calling Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I am very pleased to be taking part in this landmark debate when the Chamber is considering a tax bill for the first time in the history of the Parliament. I hope it will be the first of many devolved tax bills when we will grapple with the pros and the cons and the trade-offs of different rates and reliefs and incentives. Now, central to any devolved tax bill is something that's not in the bill at all, namely the block grant adjustment. And I think we should briefly consider that, because it's actually probably the most important of all the things that we might discuss today, because unless we can get that right, it's not worth our while going down this route at all. Now, like the Cabinet Secretary and others, I am concerned that if we rely only on OBR estimates of what might have been or would be raised post 2015, we may have an overestimate from them. That's what they usually do, and then we'll have too much money taken off our grants. So I am minded to support the Cabinet Secretary's proposal in committee that we should be looking at how much was raised in the 5 years up to 2015 as a basis for those negotiations. Now, I think some people putting in written submissions regretted that the bill wasn't more radical, but my understanding is that the tax was devolved subject to it to being a tax on land transactions. So obviously the government had to follow that. But the decision to raise the same amount of money was, I think, the decision of the government. I'm not quibbling with that decision. But if we think about it, where more restricted reliefs are being proposed in the interest of simplification and also in order to target avoidance. So I think what that does mean is if the same amount of money is going to be raised, there will be a slightly more generous banding system, probably when the detailed bands and rates are announced. And I don't quibble with that either. I certainly support, like others, the progressive system that's envisaged instead of the slab system, and I would like that to be very progressive, as it were. And in that sense, I seem to be agreeing with the Cabinet Secretary an awful lot today. I was quite pleased with his suggestion about helping first-time buyers and just ensuring that people with pretty expensive houses, I think over £325,000 paid more. So that's certainly one that I would certainly look at sympathetically. Now, different views were expressed, of course, about when the Cabinet Secretary should announce the different bands and rates, and it was quite difficult for the committee. But I think on balance it was the people concerned with commercial property who wanted an announcement well in advance, whereas the Edinburgh Solicitors Property Centre in my own neck of the wood really didn't want it to be announced many days before the actual start of the tax. So, I mean, one conclusion from that might be that we should have different dates for the announcement of the commercial and the residential. Okay, I give you.
Stuart Stevenson.
Now, while this does cover a loophole, on the 21st of March 2012, the Chancellor announced that with immediate effect there would be a 15% stamp duty on transactions through companies where there were over 2 million. So a number of these changes can be made very quickly indeed.
Well, that's a fair point. I wouldn't disagree. Now, obviously, ensuring there's no tax avoidance is an important part of this bill, and the general provisions being referred to, which is coming in the tax management bill. Specific measures in this bill, and a lot of the debate obviously has been around sub-sale relief, and I think, as Ken McIntosh said, we on this side would generally support what he's saying on sub-sale relief, while ensuring that forward funding arrangements to enable site development are protected. I mean, I think we should be looking at the suggestion of Gavin Brown if there is any territory between tax avoidance and forward funding, but I'm not particularly persuaded of that at the moment. Now, charities took quite a lot of our time in committee because it was intrinsically interesting, although it's not actually going to be an enormous issue in terms of the number of charities from out with Scotland. But I noticed that David Robb, who heads up Oscar, suggested there were easier ways to identify bona fide charities apart from registration with Oscar. So I think perhaps we should follow his advice on that. Now, the committee, like the Cabinet Secretary, wasn't persuaded about the release for energy efficiency. I was probably a bit more sympathetic to them than others, but I do think that the paper that we received from the UK Green Building Council, which Ken McIntosh also mentioned, is worth looking at as part of our Stage 2 considerations, not least because it is revenue neutral. It's not claiming to be dealing with all the issues around incentivising energy efficiency, but it certainly is worth looking at. Well, I won't go into the details of it now, but I certainly think we should still keep that as something that we consider as part of our considerations. Now, in the last minute, just briefly on the administration issues, Mary Scanlon obviously mentioned the concerns about IT systems at Registers of Scotland, although we're assured that those have now been sorted out. We certainly hope so. I think the main issue to be resolved is the respective roles of Revenue Scotland and Registers of Scotland. One of the officials from Registers of Scotland said words to the effect that he didn't know whether they would just be advising on forms or on aspects of the tax. So that clearly has to be ironed out in the coming period. And the last concern that was raised, or certainly one other concern that was raised, was that payment will have to be made prior to registration. The Council of Mortgage Lenders said that would be all right if the system of advance notices under the Land Registration Act was introduced before LBTT. I have to say I haven't got a clue what the system of advance notices is, but I'm very happy to follow the advice of the Council of Mortgage Lenders in that regard.
Many thanks. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Michael McMahon. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's encouraging that there's widespread welcome for the replacement for SDLT with a simpler and more progressive tax, especially the replacement of the slab system, whereby a huge increase in tax could come from a tiny increase in price. I think the committee as a whole was very positive about the bill and the tax, with the clear conclusion that supports the principles of the bill. It's mainly around the edges that we had questions or suggestions for improvements. But I think my first main point today would be to say how exciting I think it is that we are actually having this debate at all today. Debating the introduction of the first new tax in Scotland, OK, it's only a small tax, but I do think there's something very symbolic about it. It shows the country and the Parliament is moving forward to a new level of maturity, not only spending a block grant that has been given to us, but also involved in raising some of the revenues that we can spend. And this will be a challenge, not least for the Finance Committee itself, in gaining both the expertise and finding the time to properly examine and challenge the new tax as it is put into effect. As I said, this is a relatively small tax, and there are bigger taxes still to come, especially the share of income tax. But it is the first step, I believe, on the latest stage of the constitutional journey. It is one more step closer to fiscal autonomy, one more step closer to independence. And it seems to me inevitable that we will eventually reach independence. The only real question is exactly when that takes place.
Neil Findlay.
Given that he's expressed his excitement about today, I wonder if he would express some contrition about opposing the Calman Commission and the Scotland Act that brought us to this very exciting day.
John Mason.
I don't think that's quite on subject, and given that Calman proposed a system of block grant reduction which would have damaged Scotland, I'm not particularly a fan of Calman, I have to say. Returning to the tax itself, how we do this sets precedents for future taxes. The Cabinet Secretary referred to the principles of getting it right at this stage, and I must say I am very comfortable with the 4 principles mentioned by him, quoting Adam Smith, of certainty, taxpayer convenience, efficiency and proportionality in relation to ability to pay. We spent a lot of time looking at reliefs, and it was interesting that some of the same people who asked for simplification in this tax also seem to be asking for more and more reliefs. In fact, some of the witnesses, it appeared, did not really want to pay any tax at all. Now, I'd just like to spend a moment on that point, because the suggestion is that we must be competitive and so we must lower all taxes. But this is far too simplistic a view. Sure, tax is one factor when companies come to make decisions about location, but an educated workforce is another. And we cannot have an educated workforce if we do not have taxation to fund schools, colleges and so on. So tax is inherently a good thing. That is how we fund public services. But of course we do accept that tax has to be at a reasonable level. Just to comment very briefly on some of the reliefs that we discussed, sub-sale relief, I think there was quite a lot of confusion initially in the committee and some of the witnesses perhaps between funding mechanisms and some sub-sale relief. And the example given of a farm which is bought and then split amongst the 3 neighbouring farmers seemed to be quite a good one. On zero-carbon homes relief, it has not clearly worked under SDLT, and we took evidence, I think, from a number of enthusiastic witnesses, but it seems to me a very blunt instrument to use LBTT for what is actually a good aim. On charities, we're looking for a practical solution, I think, and Oscar has clearly set the bar for charities and qualifying as a charity very high, and we don't want to compromise that so that any charity anywhere could count. On tax avoidance, we discussed that at length, and I was just looking again at Spice's briefing, where they said tax avoidance is distinct from tax evasion in that avoidance exploits loopholes in the law, while evasion entails illegal activity. And of course, within avoidance, generally it's been traditionally held that there is moral avoidance, i.e., for example, claiming your tax allowance, and immoral avoidance, which is going against the spirit of the legislation. So we need to be clear. It seems that some reliefs there are, the more doors there are for avoidance. The more reliefs, the more avoidance there's likely to be. And I know this will be dealt with in the Tax Management Bill with its general anti-avoidance rule. We spent less time on exemptions, and generally it's assumed that the exemptions will be much as they are at present. I have some questions about exemption on death, as this could maintain the richer-poorer gap with wealth staying in richer families. However, I do take the point that inheritance tax is intended to address this. The question of rates and when they should be announced has come up. In paragraph 10, the committee welcomes the progressive structure, and clearly we've heard already a number of times that some people would like the rates announced sooner rather than later. Yet on the other side, how can the Cabinet Secretary make future budget announcements so far ahead and tie his own hands? We do not know what house prices will be like, the wider economy, let alone the block grant and the related adjustments. What we do have is an indication that LBTT will be broadly revenue neutral, which I guess is a pretty strong indication of where the rates are likely to be. The relationship with HMRC is crucial for all 3 taxes, and it seems so far that if we make changes affecting Scotland, we have to pay the bill. If Westminster makes the changes, we have to pay the bill. I don't think that was originally the intention, and I have to say I'm somewhat suspicious of HMRC, but hopefully I'll be proven wrong. So in conclusion, I'm more than happy to support this bill and this tax, and especially happy that this is the first step in the next stage of our journey as a country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now calling Michael McMahon to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is not the first time that I've had to take part in a Stage 1 debate in which, by the time it comes for you to make your contribution, there is very little which can be said that has not been said before. The truth is, though, that having listened to the often very technical and complex evidence provided by an array of witnesses we had before the committee, and having read the detailed and informative written submissions to the Finance Committee, we can do no more than conclude that the Land and Building Transaction Tax is a very welcome addition to the powers available to the Scottish Government to make decisions here in Scotland, which will better reflect the circumstances in relation to property markets in this part of Britain. There is very little which can be found to criticise in the detail of the bill, and any concerns were more to do with issues such as implementation within the overall taxation regime across the UK. As others have said, there will now be major challenges ahead when agreement over block grant adjustments have to be reached between the different legislative jurisdictions. However, the structure of LBTT is not in itself subject to any great concern. Indeed, more than one voice was heard to say how welcome it is that this opportunity has been provided through the Scotland Act to replace the stamp duty land tax with all its inherent flaws. And as has been said, among the most welcome aspects of LBTT is the removal of the slab structure and to see it replaced with a progressive structure. Witnesses were very supportive of this approach, and none more so than the Council of Mortgage Lenders Scotland, who, in rightly identifying that there would be inevitably winners and losers out of any new system, they preferred to look on the positive and highlighted the fact that a progressive system would be more equitable and overcome some of the inefficiencies created by the slab system. However, there were some concerns that there could be a disproportionate effect on high-value transactions liable to the top rate of LBTT, and CMLS were joined by CBI Scotland in identifying that concern. But I have to say that I am less concerned about that aspect of LBTT, as the Scottish Government will continue to make sure that those in the higher cost houses get a nice wee discount on their properties through the council tax freeze, which gives them those with the most deep pockets and the biggest homes. So the CBI are right, though, in my view, to argue that when setting the rates for higher value domestic properties, the Scottish Government would need to take cognizance of rates that apply elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But where I believe that most concern arises with some justification is in the uncertainty which may arise around LBTT rates in the lead-up to the introduction of the tax, especially in relation to commercial property, as this may discourage investment in the Scottish market. And while Adam Smith may be very proud of the adherence of the Cabinet Secretary to the laissez-faire free market policies that he laid down, I think in terms of the uncertainty around taxation, I don't think he would be very keen to endorse the Cabinet Secretary's position. I have read and re-read all of the evidence made available to the committee and cannot find anyone other than the Cabinet Secretary himself who gave evidence which ran counter to the view that this might be a problem. For us to conclude that there was a range of views on the subject stretches credulity to the limits. Any statistical analysis of evidence brought before the committee could only lead us to the view that the Cabinet Secretary was in fact an outlier when it came to the weight of where the evidence lay. The Law Society of Scotland, in commenting that residential rates would not be quite so important, they did express concern that the forward timescale is important for commercial property. And in general, witnesses were very clear on the view that the absence of any indication of likely future rates of LBTT created an additional layer of uncertainty. And most importantly, I think, was the view posited by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, who argued that the lack of clarity on even provisional figures of tax rates or bands goes against the principle of certainty in taxation. Now, given the concerns raised over the slump in construction, which again emerged in this morning's GDP figures, it is very worrying for me that the Scottish Building Federation conveyed to the committee a message that, in relation to commercial rates, they would prefer there to be a minimum of 12 months between the publication and the impact, and if we could get towards 18 months, that would be even more preferable. As both Homes for Scotland and the Scottish Property Federation were supportive of this view, and with Brodie's informing the committee that the feedback which they had received from commercial clients is that they were concerned that there is uncertainty, I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to seriously reconsider his position on this matter, as it may have a direct impact on the construction industry in particular in its battle out of economic downturn. And as many witnesses attested, if specific rates cannot be published, guidance about the intentions and an indication of the top rate would at least be welcome. I think that is the very least that they should be able to expect. But overall, I believe that this is a good piece of legislation delivered under a devolved settlement, which will help Scotland look at its own property markets and address the concerns that exist within that sector at the present time. And I will be very encouraged by the Cabinet Secretary if he could give us some indication that he will reconsider that major point of concern. It was the only one that divided the committee, and I think it would be useful if we could have that gap closed between those who have got the concerns and the government as they bring forward this legislation. The legislation is very worthy of support. It just needs a little bit more effort to make it a bit more perfect in terms of what we actually need. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Alison McInnes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I rise to speak as a former member of the Finance Committee who, while I wasn't part of the deliberations at stage 1 of this bill, I was part of the committee when evidence was being taken around the transfer of powers as part of the Scotland Act 2012, and I'll touch upon that as part of my contribution. I think there are sort of 3 key areas that I wanted to look at within my speech, and the first of those was around the progressive nature of this tax being introduced by the Scottish Government. The second was around the administration of taxation within Scotland, but specifically with relation to this tax, and then the principle of greater control. I think that the progressive nature, the idea that the burden of payment should reflect the ability of the payee to bear it, I think is the principle that has guided the introduction of this legislation. And I think if we look at some of the supportive comments that have been made, Isabel Dinverno, the convener of the Law Society of Scotland's Tax Law Committee, saying, "We strongly support the replacement of the slab system of stamp duty land tax, which many perceive as unfair due to the steep rise in tax for properties just above the thresholds. This distorts the market by keeping prices artificially low and gives rise to tax avoidance. We are certain that the proposed new progressive structure will be fairer and simpler for those buying a house." The Edinburgh Solicitor Property Centre agreed, saying in the Evening Times that the current slab structure of stamp duty creates inequalities in the level of taxation paid. And the Council of Mortgage Lenders Scotland, I note in their submission to the Finance Committee, said that while there would be winners and losers out of any new system, we believe a progressive system would be more equitable and overcome some of the inefficiencies created by the slab system. And I think that this will be an important measure, certainly from a member who represents the north east of Scotland, an area where property prices are high. And what that means is not necessarily just that property is expensive and towards the upper end of the scale to which this duty would apply, but what it means is that those properties further down the property ladder also see their prices inflated, and therefore, where at the moment stamp duty is exempted below £125,000, you will struggle to find a decent-sized family property, for example, in Aberdeen and parts of the North East, which would fit within that bracket. So by raising the threshold under the proposals for which duty would not apply, I believe the Scottish Government will benefit constituents of mine in the North East, many of whom either young families or first-time buyers who are looking to make that step onto the property ladder. So I welcome the move, and I would disagree with some of the comments that have been made throughout the process that first-time buyers aren't necessarily looking to buy these kind of properties. In some areas of Scotland, if you are a first-time buyer, that is absolutely the only kind of properties that are available to you to buy. So it is a welcome measure that the Scottish Government is taking in introducing these the new levels as part of the LBTT. In terms of the administration element, I welcome the establishment of Revenue Scotland. I think, in particular, I welcome the fact that it will be able to deliver greater efficiency in the administration of tax. The administration costs will be around 25% lower than those of HMRC. I think that will be not just of benefit to the Scottish Government, but obviously to the taxpayer as well, because it will free up some of the inefficiencies that might otherwise have existed within the system. And when I was on the Finance Committee and we took evidence from HMRC in relation to the introduction of new tax powers, I recall asking them at the committee whether, in theory, they could refuse to administer these new taxes on behalf of the Scottish Government were the Scottish Government to take a radically different approach to that which already existed within the rest of the UK, and they replied that, in theory, yes, they could. Now, I think that would have meant that the Scottish Government might have found itself unnecessarily hamstrung had it chosen not to establish Revenue Scotland and rely on HMRC, because it would potentially have been unable to create a different kind of system along the lines of LBTT. So I think that by establishing Revenue Scotland, it has allowed the Scottish Government that flexibility and that ability to do something different. But I think that Revenue Scotland also demonstrates that this Government and this Parliament is capable of handling the burden of greater power, greater responsibility being handed to us. With that having been said, Presiding Officer, we must accept that at the moment, with these new taxes being transferred to Scotland, there will still remain 85% of tax paid in Scotland will remain reserved.
and this Parliament will only have control and responsibility of 58% of the revenue spent in Scotland. So what I want to see, and what this government wants to see, is that shifting more towards Scotland having greater control of the revenues and to having all of the revenues of Scotland and the taxation powers of Scotland at its disposal. And I think if the LBTT serves as nothing else, it does serve as a microcosm that this Parliament, this government, can do something radically different to that which already exists within the status quo. We can do something different, something more innovative, something more progressive on taxation when the powers exist in this Parliament to do so. So I look forward to the day, Presiding Officer, the LBTT comes into force, but I also look forward to the day that this Parliament takes control of the other taxation powers and the revenue-raising powers that would exist with independence, because I believe that what we are doing here demonstrates that a different approach is not just possible, it's also optimal.
Thank you very much. Now call on Alison McInnes to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I too welcome today's Stage 1 debate on what is the first of a series of bills being taken forward as a result of a number of tax-raising powers being devolved by the Scotland Act 2012. I must admit to a certain disadvantage this afternoon. I think most of the speakers up until now have been members of the Finance Committee. I haven't had that benefit. Replacing stamp duty land tax is an opportunity for the Scottish Government to make the most of these new powers and to come up with a Scottish system for taxing land transactions that is modern and efficient, tackles avoidance and is better aligned with Scots law and practices. And we've heard from John Swinney how he believes that's the case. However, this is also an opportunity to take forward some of the Government's policy priorities. These new powers could be used to design a system that incentivises the reuse of empty properties, the development of brownfield sites, as well as tackling fuel poverty and climate change, I hope. I fear that the Government has not been quite as ambitious as it could have been when designing this land and building transaction tax. Firstly, let me mention the shift that everyone's spoken about from the current slab structure to the more progressive one. I do want to ask the Minister about this because, although it does sound appealing, I do have a concern about the impact of this change on house prices. While avoiding the sudden increases in liabilities that are a feature of the slab system and create distortions in the market, that does sound attractive, but does anyone lose out from this? The distortions in the market are where house prices cluster below the 125,000 and the 250,000. The Government's proposed system will remove the incentive for sellers to price their property below these thresholds, and house prices could increase. While I recognise that feedback from witnesses has been supportive, I think we must bear in mind that the committee only heard evidence from estate agents and house builders, as I understand it, hardly neutral players in the debate. And I don't think we've really heard the views of those trying to buy property. So can I press the Minister to reassure me, the Cabinet Secretary, to reassure us that he has given consideration to the specific impact of the bill on property prices? There's just a nagging worry that under the Government plans, buyers in those particular regions of the market may end up paying more for their houses. The other issue that I want to focus on is the lack of measures in the bill to contribute to the Government's priorities on tackling climate change and poverty. And I know what the Cabinet Secretary has had to say today on this to Ken McIntosh, but like him, I think we must use all the levers we have in our toolbox really to change behaviour. The zero carbon homes relief has not been included in the bill on the basis that it didn't achieve its objectives. And I do know that this specific relief attracted very few applications, but I think there's still a good case for including a relief related to energy efficiency. And indeed, the Government's consultation found that 2/3 of respondents wanted this tax to support key Government priorities, with energy efficiency being by far the most supported priority. So I would ask them to give further consideration to that at stage 2. Witnesses giving evidence to the committee were clear that the energy efficiency of a property, as others have said, is not a top priority for buyers at the moment, but perhaps it ought to be. Perhaps we ought to try. Surely. Kenneth Gibson.
Thanks very much, Alison. It's meant to be a helpful intervention. I think, to be honest, all the committee were really quite keen to see something along those lines. The issue is something which could actually work in practice, and I think that was the difficulty the committee struggled with. It wasn't the aim or intention, it was the practicality in terms of this legislation. And if something practical could come forward, I'm sure it would be considered.
Thank you. Could members remember to use full names, please?
Well,
McInnes.
can I thank the convener of the Finance Committee for that helpful intervention, and I hope that he's open to any suggestions that come forward at stage 2 that have been worked through and actually bring practical solutions. Because I think Charles Booth from the Existing Homes, the Alliance, explained that it's clear at the moment that energy efficient isn't a significant factor, but part of the reason for introducing that relief is to make it an efficient, a significant factor. This wouldn't be the magic bullet, but it might just improve the chances of people taking seriously the energy efficiency of their properties. And surely with continuously, inexorably, let me make some progress, rising fuel charges, people will start to look at this. There was much discussion in the committee about how the scheme could work, and I do want the government and indeed the committee to explore this at stage 2. It's clear that there are a number of policies needed, including existing council tax reliefs and government grants, but I think this could play a key role. There are already concerns that the government is watering down its level of ambition by proposing to delay the introduction of energy-efficient standards for private homes. So many respondents to the government's sustainable housing strategy consultation support these incentives. There is a potential for the new tax to be used as a lever to influence behaviour and achieve results, and I do urge the Minister to consider that. There is also an opportunity to have a lower tax on empty property brought back into use or property built on brownfield sites, and I'd ask the Minister to set out what consideration has been given to these. The Government's recent consultation on taking forward this talked about modest new powers over a small number of devolved taxes, and then it asked for full tax-raising powers. And one of the first questions on the consultation on the new landfill tax seeks views on an aggregates levy being devolved. I would like the Scottish Government to be more ambitious about the taxes that it does have control over. Getting these right could boost the economy directly and indirectly and benefit home buyers, businesses and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Richard Lyle to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To join with Alison McInnes, I actually am not a member of the Finance Committee either. Here. As already has been stated, but I will repeat, the Land and Building Transaction Tax is a significant piece of legislation, representing the first transfer of meaningful fiscal power from London to Scotland under the terms of the Scotland Act 2012. It means that from April 2015, the Scottish Parliament will be empowered to introduce and manage taxes on the purchase or leasing of land or buildings and the disposal of waste to landfill. But even after these measures are in place, 85% of taxes paid in Scotland is managed by Westminster. This Scottish Parliament only manages 15% of taxes. Yet again, this shows that we should have the responsibility for all taxes paid in Scotland. I believe that this Government has demonstrated an approach to taxation that is equitable and fair, especially when we remember the action taken over the council tax. LBTT covers a range of property transactions. I believe that LBTT would not be disruptive to activity in the housing market. Indeed, there are features within LBTT that would smooth some undue distortions. With the LBTT progressive system of taxation, the valuation of tax applied would be more reflective of the total value of the house being sold, and this may see an end to the inefficiencies in the market arising from stamp duty. The LBTT may also provide an opportunity to incentivise first-time buyers to enter the market. Evidence from the most recent stamp duty holiday suggests it did not greatly assist first-time buyers into the housing ladder, as high deposit requirements usually remained the single biggest obstacles. And I remember when my son bought his first house, how much a deposit he had to put down at that time, which was quite horrendous. Any assistance in the form of discounts or exemptions should be welcome, as every first-time buyer gains a foothold in the housing ladder, creates a knock-on effects higher up. I note the Scottish Government will need to consider carefully the proper levels at which to introduce the rates of tax so as to avoid unnecessary market distortions. Any disparity could introduce inequalities into the market and make it more difficult for households to move up the ladder. Even whilst acknowledging that one of the aims of the progressive system of taxation is to place a greater burden upon those who have the broadest shoulders, it is well worth pointing out that the high house prices are not always matched by households that are either cash-rich or have a high income. Various sources suggest that the current system sees people paying too much tax and distorts the housing market. In the Stage 1 report in the LBTT, the Finance Committee noted the need to consider the timing of the announcement. The timing of this announcement is also extremely important to the residential housing market. We must ensure that the legislation is implemented in a fair, equitable fashion to avoid introducing unnecessary blockages in the market, and this would affect the affordability of properties up and down the housing ladder. It has also been suggested that the timing of the announcement of final rates, bands for the tax has great implications for the residential housing market. This announcement should occur as close to the implementation date of the LBTT as practicable to avoid creating undue distortions. And I note the Cabinet Secretary's comments today. We have been advised that this is cash neutral. But in some of the briefings we have received, various scenarios have been presented. And I know from one scenario it actually gives winners and losers. One scenario states that 50.7% would pay less, 38.9% would pay the same, and over 10% would pay more. But I'm sure the Government will give serious consideration to what is best for the market. Everyone under 125,000 continues to pay nothing and is unaffected. Everyone from 125,000 to 327 is better off by up to £5,000. Everyone buying a £320,000 house or more will pay more. Households buying a house for £400,000 will pay nearly over £4,750 more under the scheme. Households buying a house for £1 million will pay £23,750 more in tax. I have to say the socialist within me agrees with these proposals. Tax should be fair, and I support this bill. Proposals will also help to clamp down on the tax avoidance. Replacing the current rates of stamp duty land tax will help clamp down on tax avoidance and evasion. Also, current any anti-avoidance provisions are complex and difficult to understand, but these will be replaced with a general anti-avoidance, anti-abuse rule. I think today we've seen a very cross-party support right across this chamber for this proposal, and I welcome the proposals as made by the Government. And I note that many of the supported quotes and some of the which we have received, nearly everyone supports the proposal and the implementation of this bill, and I certainly do. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Neil Findlay to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate today for a variety of reasons. The Land and Buildings Transaction Tax generally appears to be a good thing. It moves us in the right direction. It should be more responsive, as people have said, to the Scottish housing market, and that is a good thing. I'm also pleased to see that it will be much more progressive than the stamp duty system which it replaces. It should always be that those with more pay more, and that the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax sets a good example for the Scottish Government to follow, but not just in determining this tax, but all others too. Labour supports the principle of progressive taxation throughout the tax system, and again I believe that's a good thing. As far as the bill is concerned, I support the proposal to curtail tax avoidance by ending the loopholes that have been extensively exploited by clever accountants and others. The changes to the release regime is therefore very welcome. Under these proposals, avoiding this tax will be much more difficult, and I commend the Scottish Government for introducing this element. This is the right way to go on this bill, but I also hope on others. We need to ensure that the revenues to pay for public services are collected and collected efficiently. And on that note, I hope that there are further provisions within the forthcoming procurement bill to prevent companies who engage in systematic tax avoidance from winning contracts and securing government grants. I was very heartened. I don't see Mr. Mason. Oh, I do see Mr. Mason in his place. I was very heartened by his comments on taxation, and tax is a good thing. and it should be progressive in its nature, and I certainly hope that he will use the outstanding influence I know he has within his own party to convince the Finance Secretary that his party's corporation tax policy is exactly the opposite of that. Of course, Presiding Officer, it is of vital importance that the revenue from tax meets the shortfall that will arise as a result of the adjustment to the block grant, as I think Malcolm Chisholm eloquently explained. I understand that the approach by Mr Swinney is to promote a position where any reduction in the grant would be calculated on that 5-year average. Whether the Treasury agree to this or not, I am sure is something for his negotiating team, but it is vital that the worst result we have is for it to be a neutral settlement. We cannot afford to lose any money from the public services pot that is already under very intense pressure. But, Presiding Officer, this bill is a lesson to us. It comes, as people have said, as the first of 3 bills, one being on landfill and the other one on tax management. These come as a direct consequence of the Scotland Act, an act that I believe shows how devolution can and has developed and grown in the interests of our people. It shows how, since 1999, devolution has not been a static settlement, but adaptable and able to develop over time, delivering Scottish solutions that best meet our needs. And it shows how progressive policies can develop within the framework of devolution, and that imagination and political will are much more important and effective than standing on the sidelines, repeatedly stamping your feet, saying that only independence can deliver change. The bill shoots that fox and highlights how we do not need independence and all the unknowns and vagaries that may come with it, but shows how we can develop our own solutions whilst still retaining our link to our brothers and sisters in the rest of the United Kingdom. And maybe this will encourage the Scottish Government to put more energies into utilising the powers we have at present, and ones that we will soon have, before squealing about the ones we don't. And finally, Presiding Officer, this bill has emerged... certainly, Mr Mason.
John Mason.
Well, I thank the member for giving way. But then, would he not? He's already mentioned corporation tax. Would he not like to see us having control of corporation tax?
Neil Findlay.
I most certainly would not like to see you having powers over corporation tax. Absolutely not. Finally, Presiding Officer. Finally, you set yourself up for that one. Finally, Presiding Officer, this bill has emerged from the Scotland Act, which in turn arose as a result of the Calman Commission, a commission proposed by Labour and supported by some other parties in here, but unfortunately not the SNP. This follows a familiar pattern that we can trace back through the history of devolution. Labour proposes the significant transfer and decentralisation of powers only for the Nationalists to rubbish it, refuse to take part in any discussions and deride it as a useless waste of time. Then, lo and behold, when all the hard graft is done, to jump on the bandwagon and claim that it's a progressive step that they fully support. Not at the moment, Mr Hetland. They did it with the Constitutional Convention, and they're doing it now. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I support the introduction of this tax. It strengthens devolution. In practical terms, it reforms land transactions in a positive and progressive way, and I would urge all parties to support it, even the repentant sinners who oppose Calman and the Scotland Act.
Thank you. I call Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Although I am not a member of the Finance Committee, I nevertheless relish the opportunity of speaking in this important debate. Some of our colleagues, not any of those in the chamber this afternoon, but some of them have suggested that this is a somewhat technical and dry subject. On the contrary, I believe it's interesting and quite profound. And I must congratulate the Finance Committee for producing an excellent report. It's concise and readable, whilst covering all the important points, and most importantly, it's accessible to someone like myself who's not sat through all of the committee's deliberations. And although I welcome further powers coming to this Parliament, I'm not a huge fan of the 2012 Scotland Act, largely because it was a missed opportunity to do so much more. What is important, though, in the context of this debate, is that this Scottish Government and this Parliament have seized the opportunity to address the long-standing neglect of the problems presented by stamp duty, something the Westminster Parliament has failed to do. And that indicates to me the profound difference between the two parliaments, one which is old and slow-moving, and ours, which is agile and able. and can quickly respond to new opportunities. And this is just one of the many understated assets of this Parliament. Speed isn't everything, though, and that brings me back to the bill and the committee's report, where it's obvious that quality hasn't been sacrificed in the process of scrutiny. A further thing that strikes me is in how positively the prospect of change has been embraced by those involved in the property sector. All of the responses to the committee seem to be positive. Even all of the responses this afternoon in the Chamber seem to be positive, all but not quite. There's a tangible sense of relish, of excitement, of positive possibility in the responses that augurs well for the future of Scotland and suggests a widespread appetite for many more powers coming to this Parliament. Presiding Officer, I suggest that members should contemplate the power of this effect writ large right across Scotland as we collectively address the opportunities of independence. I would suggest that this effect will bring a boost to the commonweal and to our economy. It will bring what you might call an independence bounce. And already the approach to this bill signifies a further profound difference between this Parliament and Westminster as we take the opportunity to make this tax fairer and simpler, whilst at the same time taking care to avoid distorting the market or having a perverse and detrimental economic effect. This is the essence of good policy, amply demonstrated in the approach to this bill, with the principle of social justice and hence progressive taxation at its heart. This again is fairly profound, I think, and I think this again is a point which has been missed by some of those who made representations to the committee. Progressive taxation, which is fair and simple, limits both the desire and the opportunity for tax avoidance. Overburdening the bill with complexity increases the choices for unintended consequences and can create opportunity for creative and unprincipled schemes for avoidance. Some of the concerns, though, I think are well made. For example, I can sympathise with the concerns over some instances of subsale relief, particularly at a time when banks are reluctant to finance property development. I welcome the Cabinet's commitment, therefore, to consider the matter of forward funding schemes and to consider relief in that respect. And I sympathise with those who seek to improve the energy efficiency of our building stock. I think they're perfectly correct. I just don't believe that this bill is the vehicle to achieve this aim. My main concern, however, is the unbridled optimism of the OBR in forecasting stamp duty receipts over the next 6 years. I can only contrast this with their supreme and widely discredited pessimism in forecasting oil receipts over a similar period. They're either on another planet or they're merely the political puppet of the Westminster Coalition. No doubt this is purely a hollow negotiating position as they seek to reduce the block grant beyond what is reasonable. However, I have every faith that the common sense will prevail and that this posturing position will soon be punctured. I am therefore glad to welcome the opportunities presented by this bill and to commend both the Finance Committee and the Scottish Government for their approach in bringing it forward.
Thank you very much. Before I call Jean Urquhart, can I say we've got a very small amount of time in hand for interventions if members wish to take any. Jean Urquhart to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Finance Committee, I have had the opportunity to take part in the evidence sessions on the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill. And two things have struck me in those sessions. One, how broken the stamp duty land tax is as a method of taxation. And two, the fantastic opportunity to open to Scotland to begin to recalibrate its system of taxation for the public good. The description of the stamp duty land tax as a, and I quote, strong contender for the UK's worst designed tax by the Institute of Fiscal Studies is very appropriate. The slab structure of taxation under the current stamp duty system discourages sales of residential properties at prices immediately above its thresholds, creating distortions within the market and adding to the angst already suffered by those attempting to buy or sell a home. It's madness that a house worth £125,000 will result in no tax burden, but a home worth £1 more than that results in a £1,250 bill. It would be a matter of public scandal if personal income was taxed in such ways. Why then has it been deemed appropriate for house sales to be carried out this way? The proposed move from stamp duty's slab structure to a progressive structure under the auspices of the land and building transfer tax is therefore to be welcomed, particularly in the current housing climate. There are already enough challenges posed by the unsustainable housing bubble to men, women and families across Scotland in finding affordable housing. And I'm glad to see us removing some of these challenges by making common sense reforms where and when we can. One of the other major problems with the current SDLT regime is the amount of money lost through tax avoidance schemes. The removal of subsale relief, which has been frequently identified as a facilitator of tax avoidance, from the LBTT will hopefully work in tandem with the Government's other anti-avoidance measures to help increase the tax take and ensure that everybody pays their fair share. One of the other measures that will greatly benefit my constituents is the proposal to exempt rural housing bodies from paying LBTT. As I have said before in this chamber, any steps that we can take to promote the building of affordable housing should be considered, and hopefully this will encourage more to be built. Although there are many elements of the bill that are to be considered further at stage 2, and indeed others such as the taxation bans, collection arrangements and block grant adjustments that will require further scrutiny in the months and years to come, I think I speak for the whole committee when I say that we are encouraged by the considered, deliberative and open approach being taken by the Government on this bill. Although I am aware that the Cabinet Secretary is not inclined to support relief for zero-carbon homes, I am aware of a proposal for fiscally neutral energy efficiency modifier that has emerged since oral evidence was given by energy organisations in February. And I reference Alison McInnes's comments, and pleased that the committee convener is amenable to looking at this again. I think that would be further progress in a progressive taxation. I must confess that in considering this bill, I was mindful of the suggestions raised in Professor Mirrlees' review and echoed by Andy Whiteman in his submission to the consultation on what sort of taxation regime we should have for property. And I certainly have sympathy with Mr Whiteman's suggestion for a radical overhaul of the way in which we think about land and property, but I am also aware that the Scotland Act 2012 only allowed for any replacement of SDLT to be a tax on transactions. Therefore, although I would be inclined to support some sort of land value tax, I appreciate that we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good on this occasion, and that the land building transfer tax provides a solid move towards a more equitable system. Finally, Presiding Officer, I note that this is the first of 3 pieces of legislation emanating from the Scotland Act 2012 that will begin to increase this Parliament's powers, and I look forward to the day that this Parliament has the full and normal powers of any other nation's Parliament and is able to bring about the substantive changes in our economy and society we do desperately need. I support the bill.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I rise as yet another non-member of the Finance Committee. This is quite a complex bill, and one of the ways you can decide it's complex is by looking and realising that approximately 3/4 of the pages in the bill actually form the schedules. And my suspicion always is that if government wants to hide something, you put it in the schedules, not in the bill. Let me just give you a little example in looking at Schedule 5 of the 1998 Scotland Act, which I was doing earlier today, and I refer to Section B 3, which is about elections. I have discovered today that, in fact, we have the power in this Parliament to run elections for members of the House of Lords, because the only things that are excluded from our powers are elections to the House of Commons, the European Parliament and this Parliament. That is why we can organise local authority elections, and by implication, we could also organise elections to the House of Lords. It's unlikely they could take their seat, but that's another matter. But if you want to hide difficult things, sometimes the schedules is the place to do it. And maybe Neil Findlay and I might bring a private member's bill forward to organise elections to the House of Lords, or maybe we won't bother. But on the matter of taxation, he's woken up, Presiding Officer. On the matter of taxation, I think I will, yes.
Neil Findlay.
If we did that, what would Lord Stevenson's official title be?
Well, there have been 2 Lord Stevensons already. One of Cobbenham, whom we no longer talk about as the chair of HBOS, and the other a distant relative of mine whom I'll pass over as well. But let me start by congratulating the Government in bringing forward this complex but rather comprehensive piece of legislation, which clearly is getting consensus support. But more fundamentally, let me congratulate parliamentary colleagues of all parties for a committee report that I can only describe as pellucid in its delineation of the issues. It is a good, rattling read. It covers the issues extremely well. I want to cover 1 or 2 of them in the time available. First of all, on sub-legislation, I sit on that committee, Subordinate Legislation Committee. The Government has a very good record in responding to what that committee says, and I'm encouraged that we'll be looking seriously at whether it should be negative or affirmative procedures for a number of the powers that are in there, and I hope that's picked up. Now, in the matter of sub-sale, I, of course, not sitting in on the discussions of the committee, haven't perhaps caught the full nuances of the discussions that have been. But I do think there is a case for having a taxation regime where there are concurrent sales of a big bit and then dispersal to smaller bits, that as long as the revenue is derived from the big sales rather than the small sales, and therefore the revenue is protected, that we should make sure that we don't exclude the possibility of such sub-sales being inhibited. We don't want them to be inhibited by an appropriate tax regime. Avoidance generally is something that troubles me. If a company owns property, and of course the shares in the company are traded, the risk is that that falls outside the taxation provisions, because company law is essentially reserved. It has a more general application as well, in that much of property and land is owned beyond the boundaries of Scotland. And I think the Danish situation, where you cannot own property or land in Denmark unless there is a local representative, that is not to inhibit ultimate beneficial ownership being outside Denmark, but there is always an accountable person who discharges ownership responsibilities within the boundaries of that state. And I continue to think, as I have for some time, that that's something we should look at. I think when we... Yes?
Jamie Hepburn.
Given that that is the situation in Denmark, does the member not consider the suggestion that was posited by some organisations that the requirement for charities Firth of Scotland to register here being onerous is somewhat ludicrous?
Stuart Stevenson.
I haven't read the detail, but certainly that was my initial reaction. I have confidence in the committee in dealing with that issue. It is, of course, possible for charities registered elsewhere to represent themselves as being charities in Scotland, even though they're not registered in Scotland. So I think there are wider considerations we need to take account of. But the bottom line is that tax avoidance is always a big issue in any taxation system. I look forward to the tax management bill. I hope that when looking at tax avoidance, we're able to legislate, and this is why I was looking at Schedule 5 of the 1998 Act to see if it would be prevented, that we're able to legislate that the test will be the intent rather than application of rules, which can always be gone round. So I wait and see with interest. Registers of Scotland are a very important part of the implementation of this. I first crossed their threshold in about 1962 in my pursuit of family research. 50 years later, we have the world-beating computer systems that give access to the real records. Practically no other jurisdiction in the world. So they can do it with the right incentives and the right application. They have the potential to do it, as they have done there. Overall, Presiding Officer, what the process of this bill thus far on the behalf of Government and on the behalf of the Committee demonstrates that there is as yet untapped competence and abilities in this place, which I hope in future to see applied more widely to more taxation issues, but more fundamentally to the whole range of powers with which a normal independent country would grapple. We have the skills, we now need the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I call Jane Baxter to be followed by Marco Biaggi with a generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. And like others, I'd have to say I'm not on the Finance Committee, and I'm also speaking rather further down the queue, so I hope I can find some new things to say, but forgive me if I cover ground that's already been covered. The proposals before us have been broadly welcomed across the Chamber as an opportunity to move towards a more progressive system of taxation that is better suited to the needs of the Scottish market. A number of the submissions to the Finance Committee's consideration of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax proposals highlighted the inefficiencies of the existing slab structure of stamp duty. The significance of this change to a more progressive system, as an example that devolution can and does work, is not to be underestimated. Not only that, but the proposed changes to the structure of the tax will have an obvious and immediate impact on home buyers. The attempts to reduce some of the complexities of the tax reliefs available under existing stamp duty are also to be welcomed, as are the specific measures to attempt to minimise tax avoidance. For the past 5 years, there has been a time-limited zero-carbon homes relief, which was originally introduced to increase the public awareness of the benefits of reduced emissions and to stimulate the market for zero-carbon homes. Given there appears to be little evidence to suggest that this relief has been successful in achieving its intended objectives, I note the Scottish Government has indicated that they do not intend to make the zero-carbon homes relief available under the proposed Land Buildings Transaction Tax. And I note the Cabinet Secretary's earlier comments on this matter. But members will be aware that this Chamber recently considered the proposals to meet the emissions reductions target put forward by the Scottish Government in RPP2. And whilst I recognise that the zero-carbon homes relief was not considered to have achieved its objectives, but one of the criticisms of RPP2 was the silo nature of many of the proposals and the lack of coherence in the overall strategy of emissions reductions. I hope, therefore, that the Scottish Government, in indicating that it is willing to consider possible alternatives to zero-carbon homes relief, will also give consideration to these suggestions in other policy areas, and not just in relation to property taxation. There is appetite in some quarters for some regulatory proposals to encourage energy efficiency. The Scottish Building Federation has indicated that it would welcome a tax relief related to energy efficiency, and as an alternative have suggested tax relief for energy performance certificates. As the other major change in the property market in recent years, the introduction of home reports, currently requires energy efficiency ratings as part of the package, I hope these points will be considered by the Scottish Government when it undertakes any review of the home report system in the future. As with the RPP2 debate, while regulatory measures to ensure we meet our emissions targets are necessary, they must go hand in hand with behavioural change. And it's worth quoting COSLA, which in its evidence to the Finance Committee stated, "At present, the housing market does not currently attach any additional value to homes with higher standards of energy efficiency. The climate change targets are dependent on not only behavioural change, but a culture shift amongst buyers to value energy-efficient properties." It's not just the type of properties, energy efficient or not, that have been considered as part of the proposals in the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill before us, but the availability of properties too. The housing shortage in Scotland and the question marks over our capacity to meet the long-term demand for social housing, especially in rural areas, means that I am supportive of another of the proposed changes, which is the extension of access to relief for local authorities purchasing land or property through a compulsory purchase order. Recently, I lodged a number of parliamentary questions regarding the powers available to local authorities to deal with dilapidated buildings. We have a real problem in many communities across Scotland with run-down commercial buildings and empty homes. The extension of compulsory purchase order relief for local authorities, therefore, to enable the purchase of empty homes is to be welcomed. In meeting the challenge of affordable rural homes, other evidence to the Finance Committee highlighted the need for rural housing bodies to be relieved from paying land and buildings transaction tax on land or properties with a rural housing burden or on which a rural housing burden will be created. However, the Carnegie Trust has raised concerns that smaller, community-led rural housing bodies, which may not have gained charitable status, may find themselves liable for the tax as they fall out with the list of current reliefs. As one of the specific objectives of rural housing bodies is to meet affordable housing needs in rural areas, I would be concerned if measures remained in place which would create a barrier to the development of such housing, and I hope this worry can be reviewed and resolved. Ensuring we have affordable, accessible housing should be one of the priorities of any government, and I welcome any steps which we can take with this proposed legislation to create a fairer, more progressive tax system and to meet the housing needs of the people of Scotland. Thank you.
And Marco Biaggi, finally.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad to be debating this, and like many of the recent speakers, I'm not a member of the Finance Committee, but I am a member of the Economy Committee, so I've always had half an eye on that basis. And I have to say my cross-party consensus antennae started tingling very early in this debate. Often that's a good sign, but less so when you're speaking last and are hoping to be able to find lots of points in the opposition speeches to disagree with. Ken McIntosh's opening, in fact, in favour of devolution, reminded me very eloquently why I support independence, by focusing so well on how responsibly and how maturely we have handled the debate on LBTT and in constructing it. I think the ability of Scotland's Parliament today to use wisely the part responsibility we have can provide confidence that we could also very well bear the whole responsibility down the line. Indeed, in the Scottish Parliament, we've already adjusted those powers under those tax powers under our control, council tax, through the freeze, other smaller measures, similarly business rates. And in credit to the Labour Party, when they were in office, they too were not afraid to adjust business rates somewhat from those that had been set in Westminster, although, of course, the SNP government has since adjusted them once more. It's a sign of success and maturity as well that we have such a consensus. I think in the political dictionary, next to Scottish solutions for Scottish problems, we'll simply have this debate. I want to ask two questions, though. The first is, how has SDLT continued in its current form for so long? The slabbing effect has been roundly and repeatedly criticised from every side. There is no one defending it. The IFS, as we've heard, said in February 2013, SDLT is a contender for the UK's worst designed tax. You could call it slabbed, tiered, but I prefer to think of it as lumpy, like a badly stirred custard. A house can sell for £249,999, you pay £2,500. Sell for £1 more, you pay £7,500. The new structure on its own, if we were introducing it in a vacuum, might be complicated to explain, but since it resembles a system with which most of us are familiar in income tax, it doesn't have that problem. In the hypothetical scenario that we've seen and we've heard talked about, £185,000 simply functions like a personal allowance, with charges being levied on value beyond that. It has the benefit of being not only fairer, but also simple to understand. That's a win-win you don't often find in any field of government, let alone in tax. And even in Edinburgh, the average house price only stands slightly above the hypothetical £185,000, and such a property would see the bill drop 2/3 under that scenario. And even in 3- and 4-bedroom properties, according to the SPC, 81% or more would see lower bills, and that is within Edinburgh, clearly one of the warmest property markets in Scotland. But I think it's a mistake to fixate on the rates. Stamp duty rates, as with all taxes, can vary and have varied up to and including on budget days. The debate here is on the general principles. That is the stage of the passage of legislation. And we mustn't hang things on a frame before the structure itself is in place. Economic efficiency itself is a very worthy principle. And as John Mason alluded to earlier, since the objective of this change is to ensure revenue neutrality, it is only closer to the time when we are able to look at the evidence on which those calculations can be based that we'll be able to get a finalised rate. I think anyone looking will be able to estimate within a broad range of parameters what the liabilities are likely to be. So, really, having looked at all that, why has it taken so long? And I think the answer is simply that we have a government here and a parliament here that can respond more efficiently. The second question is one that's been touched on as well from various quarters. Why is the market, when so many people in the passage of this bill have been supportive of energy efficiency measures, why is the market itself so resistant? The zero carbon home relief created in the last budget of the Blair regime in 2007 is one of those things that sounded good in a think tank paper but didn't work once it was released into the wild. The Scottish Building Federation as well talk about relief for new build, but really we already have the lever of building standards. And the UK Green Building Council alternative is interesting, but I don't think it could be applied in practice. It's not very straightforward for residents of tenements to improve their energy efficiency, a particular constituency interest of my own. Cooperation is needed, and the technologies carry very substantial upfront costs. You know, if those properties even came within the threshold of LBTT at all, if it was 185,000, because they would be at the lower end, it would almost certainly be insufficient to deal with anything but the most perfunctory, the most minimal energy efficiency work. So while I think there is clearly a good intention there, it is not enough to achieve the material effect. And it's also, I don't think, one that would be understood enough by potential buyers to achieve the desired nudge and behavioural change. And all of this is a shame, because we really do need some innovative new mechanism. Even with all the widespread distribution of EPCs, their publications, the reality of rising gas and electricity bills, all of this has somehow stayed external to the decision-making of buyers. We do need to find a way to address that, because that is a distortion of a properly functioning marketplace. The end, though, of getting people to take more notice of energy efficiency in transactions, while is correct, the means that has been proposed isn't, and an alternative one will need to be found. This is a bill, I think, that shows what Scotland can do. And as many of my colleagues have said, it shows our potential for future responsibilities. If health, why not pensions? If schools, why not benefits? And if LBTT, why not all the other taxes as well?
Thank you very much. I was just checking if all members were in for closing speeches, because, as we know, members who have participated in the debate ought to be in for closing speeches. We now move to closing speeches, and there is more than enough time in hand to compensate the closing speakers if they so wish to take interventions. That is, of course, entirely up to closing speakers. And I call on Gavin Brown. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's been a very useful and informative and interesting debate this afternoon, but I want to reflect mainly on two key issues in my closing remarks, and those are the two key issues of contention from the Scottish Conservative point of view. I reiterate my earlier point that, of course, we will be supporting this bill at 5 o'clock today, and we approve of much that was within it. But I want to focus on, I think, the issues of contention, which I hope the Cabinet Secretary can address in his closing remarks or later in writing. And the first one, again, relates to the timing of the announcements of bans and rates. This goes to the very heart, I think, of the new tax, and I think witness after witness stressed to the committee just how important it was that we had advance warning of what the rates were likely to be in the commercial sector. Malcolm Chisholm made the point quite rightly that was made by the committee that there is a distinction between the residential sector and the commercial sector and the evidence that was given. But in terms of commercial, it was very, very strongly worded and very, very, I think, effectively put that the rates should be advertised well in advance and in every case, as I say, before September 2014. In some cases, much, much earlier than that.
Mr Brown, could I interrupt you for a moment? Would you be able to pull your microphone round slightly? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, there were some, I suppose, contentions with that, or some points made against that. One of them was made by John Mason, who said that the fact that the intention is to be revenue neutral gives an indication of where the rates are likely to be. I would take issue with that quite strongly. I think the fact that the intention is overall revenue neutral gives you absolutely no idea where the rates are likely to be for residential or commercial. If you are, I'll take it in just a second, if you have a project group putting together a bid to try and build any kind of building or decide to take a project, what should they put in the space where the tax rate is? When they have to work out the costs of the project, when they're analysing whether or not it ought to go ahead, if we don't know what the rate is, it has to be left blank. So the fact that it's revenue neutral overall, in my view, gives you almost no idea of what the rate is likely to be. I said I'd give way to Mr Stevenson. Happy to
Stuart Stevenson.
I just return to the point I made in my previous intervention about the immediate effect of a change that was made to stamp duty. I'd just amplify that by saying that was actually a change that came into effect 4 hours before the Chancellor got to his feet in the House of Commons to announce it. So there have been examples where the property market is not collapsed because things can be done at a short timescale, and I view with considerable scepticism, perhaps, some of the demands that there should be a long lead-in and announcement of a fiscal measure of this kind. Very uncommon in UK terms on any fiscal announcement that there should be such a long lead-in.
Gavin Brown.
Deputy President, this was an issue discussed at length, I have to say, on the committee, and the point was indeed made, and I was going to come to Mr Stevenson anyway, but he brought that slightly forward. I think the difference here is that we have an entirely new tax and an entirely new framework. And was said to the committee, the absence of any indication of likely future rates creates an additional layer of uncertainty. So while it's open to any Chancellor of the Exchequer to change tax rates at short notice at a budget, as indeed, as Mr Stevenson suggested, happened in March 2012, the fact that this is an entirely new tax and the fact that we don't know the full framework, we don't know any of the rates or any of the bandings of the tax, is different to simply putting up one of the rates or changing one of the bandings. And as the Scottish Property Federation said, with a different structure, as we have, there's an understanding that a more radical rate change may be introduced. So that's why I think there's a distinction between the example that Mr Stevenson gives and the discussion we're having today. So I reiterate again, I invite the Government to reconsider their approach there, particularly in relation to commercial transactions, and ask their decision to reflect the evidence that was actually given to the Finance Committee. And if they're not going to do that, then they should at least, I think, be candid and say that they are rejecting or ignoring the evidence that was given, instead of attempting to pretend that the evidence was mixed, because the evidence in relation to commercial was not mixed. It was absolutely clear. If we return to sub-sale relief, Deputy Presiding Officer, I have to say, as I said earlier, I was encouraged that the Cabinet Secretary had genuinely listened on forward funding. There was no mention of forward funding at stage in terms of the bill itself, but he made it very clear he's clearly listened to industry in relation to that and will bring forward an amendment to stage 2. I would invite him, though, to listen more closely, though, on areas of sub-sale relief that are not forward funding. I think Malcolm Chisholm again made the point that between the space of what might not be thought to be legitimate tax avoidance measures and forward funding, within that space, it is my view that there are areas of commercial transactions that most people would deem to be legitimate, that are important to our economy, particularly with reduced bank lending, the point that Mike Mackenzie, I think, ably made. There are examples, I think, of other schemes that would, I think, qualify if most people were taking an objective view about it. And I invite him again to continue to listen to commercial and to industry so that we can get this right, instead of just having wholesale abolition of subsidy relief. There might be, for example, an effect on existing part exchange schemes, as said by the Scottish Building Federation. There are various rural examples that were given to by Scottish Land and Estates. I think John Mason referred to this in his speech. He called it the farm example, but I think he indicated that he thought, in his view, that was a fair example and somewhere where subsidy relief ought to be given. Deputy Presiding Officer, we have to get the balance right, I think, between tax avoidance and being competitive and doing everything we can to help the Scottish economy. And in some ways, I think the bill has done this well, but I think in a couple of areas where I have indicated, I think the balance has tipped away too far from being competitive, and I think there are areas that we can get better at stage 2 and stage 3, so that the real priority is making the Scottish economy as competitive as it can, so that we are not put at a disadvantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Colin Roder-Grant. I can give you up to 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a more interesting debate than I might have at first thought when I saw it on the order paper. So I think I can almost welcome the 9 minutes, which is significantly more than I thought I would be filling. We in the Scottish Labour Party certainly welcome the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax. It's an example of devolution working. It's allowing the Scottish Government to design and levy a tax to suit the needs of Scotland. It must be responsive to our needs, but it also must provide us with revenue to build our public services. Can I first turn to the block grant? And it was something that I think Malcolm Chisholm spoke about very thoughtfully. There will have to be a reduction in the block grant because of the devolution of this power, and the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed that there will be a one-off reduction to the grant, and he is proposing that it should be based on a 5-year average for stamp duty and land tax receipts, based on actual receipts rather than the forecast, because of the volatility of those receipts. We know that the income generates in the tax and it fluctuates from year to year. If you take, for example, in Scotland, we raised £565 million in 07-08, but that had fallen to £275 million in 11-12. So that's quite a huge fluctuation. So I think it will be really important to know which years are going to be used for this average. Obviously, a recovering economy would mean that there would be more revenue, but this would be true for the rest of the UK as well. So we need to devise an amount that is fair and is seen to be fair by ourselves and the rest of the UK. So I think that's something that probably a great deal of thought needs to go into the future.
Michael Biaggi.
The OBR predicts a rate of growth that would take us back to the status quo ante in cash terms by about 2017-18. Do you think the OBR's predictions are perhaps a little bit implausible there?
Rosie Grant.
I think anything that involves people looking into the future is very difficult to second guess, as we've seen with a lot of predictions, including the government's own with oil and gas, which I think is the trap that Marco Biaggi was trying to set for me. But I think it's very important to maybe look at what we do get, and indeed we need to have a view to the future economy as well, because if the economy falls further, then to set a rate too high would damage us in the future. So I think what I'm asking is that more thought goes into this. Can I make a little progress, please? Can I turn to... I've got 9 minutes, but I'm seeing I'm already through 3 of them, and I've really not said an awful lot. Can I turn to the zero carbon relief? And I think a number of members spoke about it, and I appreciate that the Cabinet Secretary is looking at this further. Less taxation could mean that there will be greater value placed on energy-efficient homes, and that could mean because people would have more money to spend if they weren't paying greater taxation, and that might encourage sellers to invest in order to improve the value of their home at that selling point. Jane Baxter said that we need to look across the board when we're looking at carbon reduction, and we need a joined-up policy on this. So I think we need to examine closely every opportunity to promote energy efficiency. And Marco Biaggi said that energy efficiency certificates are not really impacted, and we need maybe to look at some research on how people look at a house and look at their ability to buy it and what things they take into account, because we really need to impress on people that energy efficiency is extremely important. We need to look at new things that are coming, new ideas on this that are coming into place. And indeed, I think, and I will take Mike Mackenzie's intervention, but I think what he'd said before was this could be regressive. However, it could be capped. But I'll take
Mike Mackenzie.
Just to reiterate that point, that given that Ken McIntosh seemed to indicate...
Sorry, Mr Mackenzie, is your microphone on?
Sorry. Ken McIntosh seemed to indicate that there was some merit in what I'd said and it given them pause for consideration. Rhoda Grant has had some time to consider that. Do you accept that this would, because it's a progressive tax, that would actually, that kind of measure that you're proposing would help the people that need it least further up the scale and not help the people that need it most, those down at the bottom of the scale?
Rhoda Grant.
There is an issue in that those at the bottom of the scale probably won't be paying any taxation at all, so tax relief won't matter. And I think where people are at the bottom of the scale, we need to look at government intervention to allow them to afford this. But this would actually maybe work to change a mindset at the top of the scale. And as I said before, it could be capped at a certain level, but it might change people's minds into thinking that actually improving the carbon efficiency of their homes and the energy efficiency of their homes is a good thing. And if we can get that into the mindset, which we have failed to do with energy efficiency certificates, I think that would be a step forward. So while I'm not advocating a specific approach, I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to look further at this and come forward maybe with new proposals on that at stage 2. Jane Baxter talked about reliefs for empty homes and compulsory purchase by councils. I think this is something that we really need to look at, how we use this tax to make the best use of our resources, which are our buildings and land. And I think, again, any move in this direction needs to be welcomed. There's concern about charity relief and indeed how you determine what a charity is in order for them to attract this relief. And I note that Malcolm Chisholm talked about Oscar having concerns about this, and I would also have some concerns about asking the Office of the Scottish Charities Regulator to be almost the linchpin, because their job is actually quite different. And if you push into their regulatory authority the ability when not and when to levy a tax, I think it might skew not only their function but the function of any reliefs that are put in place. So I think we need to give this some thought. I think everybody is keen that charities should receive reliefs, but how we do this is important. We have to be very, very careful that this doesn't impact on charitable funding, because at this time charities are all struggling, and we need to make sure that anything we do here does not impact on their funding and give them less money to be spending at this time. A lot of members talked about sub-sale relief, and I understand the reason for taking this away, because it prevents avoidance, and I think that's to be welcomed. I think a lot of the steps in this bill to deal with avoidance are very much welcome. But I also welcome the further discussions about this, just to make sure that there are no unintended consequences. Again, at a time when our economy is pretty slow, we need to make sure that we're not doing anything that impacts on the ability of our economy to recover. Can I also welcome, like many other members, the commitment to progressive scales, and I think that is very welcome across the chamber. And many members also talked about the slab way that the stamp duty and land tax had of levying tax. And I'd heard it described a lot of ways, but I think, as lumpy as a badly stirred custard was probably the one that will go down in memory as a description of a tax that is seen to be doing nothing very well. I also welcome the fact that those who are buying properties that are maybe not worth so much will not have to pay tax on this. The tension, and people talked about the tension between knowing what the taxation rate would be and the ability to evade tax. And Michael McMahon, along with others, made a plea for early notification. But that obviously depends on the bill and its ability to stop tax avoidance. But if the bill's ability to stop tax avoidance is not good, then that avoidance will eventually happen. So we need to put a solution in place. And if we have a bill that stops avoidance, also minimises the cost of administration, then we will have a bill that will deliver more taxation for our services. Presiding Officer, I'm noticing I'm running out of time. I really shouldn't be. Can I just say that this bill is about devolution and moving decisions closer to the people that they're affected by, and it allows this Parliament to take into account local priorities. We welcome this bill and its devolving of this power.
Thank you very much. And I now call on John Swinney to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has indeed been a historic occasion. I think I correctly quote Mr McMahon and Mr Chisholm as of the significance of the day. Maybe even Mr Finlay referred to it as a historic day as Parliament considers for the first time the application of legislation in relation to particular tax responsibilities. And as the Finance Minister in this Parliament, it gives me a great deal of satisfaction that Parliament is now wrestling not just with how we spend money, but how we raise money into the bargain and exercise the necessary responsibility in so doing. Before I come on to some of the issues of contention in the debate, let me refer to one of the points that Mr MacDonald raised, which was about the decisions that we had taken in relation to the administration of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax and the approach to undertaking that through Registers of Scotland under the umbrella of Revenue Scotland. Mr MacDonald made the very fair point, which was that if we had decided to undertake the implementation of a scheme to replace stamp duty land tax using HMRC as the collection organisation, the likelihood, not the certainty, but the likelihood, is that we would have had to have taken forward a tax very similar in character to stamp duty land tax. And I think what's been interesting about the debate today, and the point that Mr MacDonald makes highlights this point very significantly, is the fact that Parliament clearly has an appetite today to do something different. The contents of the Land and Building Transaction Tax, again to my satisfaction, has attracted very wide political support across the spectrum. I welcome that today. But I simply point out that had we not taken the steps to undertake the administrative approaches as we have done under the umbrella of Revenue Scotland, we would perhaps not have been able to fulfil the aspiration of Parliament to do things differently from the way in which stamp duty land tax legislation has been put together. So I think that does illustrate that we do want to pursue a different and distinctive agenda here in Scotland on issues that matter to us. We've had this power devolved to us and we've come to a different conclusion. And the administration arrangements that we've put in place support that approach into the bargain. Now, I want to talk about three particular issues that have been raised through the debate by a number of colleagues. First of all, let me comment on the issue of timing of announcements. And in a debate which has been heavily weighted towards consensus, I thought Mr McMahon was a little bit unkind to me in suggesting that somehow I was the only person that had thought there was a different range of views expressed within the evidence to the committee. I merely read out paragraph 16 of the committee report, which says the committee recognises that there was a range of views amongst witnesses regarding the timing of the publication of the proposed LBTT rates and bans, but notes that the emphasis on the desirability of advance notice relates especially to commercial property. So, I don't think I was selectively making up the evidence as I was going through the report. I think the committee makes that point. I'll give way to you.
The Cabinet Secretary, and thanks for taking the intervention, recognise that the range stretched from him on one side and everyone else on the other.
Cabinet Secretary.
No, because the immediately preceding page of the committee report, which I shall find if Parliament will give me a moment, at paragraph 14, the Edinburgh Solicitors Property Centre, and I have no vested interest in the Edinburgh Solicitors Property Centre, stated, once the decision has been communicated to the public, we will want to move as swiftly as possible to implementation. So that's the view from one of the people who gave evidence, and it wasn't me. So I'm simply saying, as the committee records, there's a range of views amongst witnesses. I'll give way to Mr Brown in the hope of perhaps cheering him up more after my response.
I'm grateful for his allowing me to intervene. He will know, of course, that the ESPC were talking about residential property and not commercial property. He will know, of course, that throughout this debate there has been a distinction drawn between residential and commercial property. Can he point to any witnesses, apart from himself, who thought for commercial property it should be done after September 2014 as opposed to considerably before?
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't quite see what Mr Brown's getting himself all worked up about the fact that I've read out the committee paragraph which clearly makes the distinction between the commercial property and residential property sections. I acknowledge that difference of view within the evidence base. What I will do is reflect on that and determine whether or not there is any other steps that I need to take to try to establish wider consensus around about this. If I move on to the second issue, which is subsale relief, and it's pretty broad agreement that the decisions the government has taken on subsale relief have been the correct decisions, but there is space to further consider, I think the way that Mr Chisholm expressed this point, the distance between essentially avoidance mechanisms and forward funding arrangements. And that is the area I will be exploring. I was a little bit concerned at the impression that Mr Brown created in his summing up, that I was perhaps going beyond that with a commitment that I would legislate for forward funding. I'm going to explore that space because I'm not yet certain I can bring to Parliament a proposition that will deliver the necessary constraints on avoidance, but make the provision for forward funding. But I am talking to a range of stakeholders, including institutional investors, to try to assist us in coming to a conclusion there. Because where I do agree with Mr Brown is there has to be a balance struck between tax avoidance and competitiveness, and we must strike that in the right fashion to maintain competitiveness, which I think from the government's record in office is clearly an aspiration of the government to act in that fashion. The third issue I'd like to comment on is the issue of block grant adjustment. And Mr Chisholm, again, and a number of members, Jane Baxter also made the same point, as did others, highlighted the desirability of perhaps moving to the block grant adjustment being undertaken as a consequence of a 5-year average of the actual numbers that have been incurred in advance of 2015, and that position was also advanced by Jamie Hepburn into the bargain. When I look at the actual receipts of stamp duty land tax between 2007-2008 and 2011-12, they have varied from a low of £250 million to a high of £565 million. When I then look at the forward projections of the OBR, as they are now currently stated as at the March 2013 budget, they range from a figure of an estimated £348 million in 13-14 to £509 million in 17-18. I would point out to Parliament there have been 3 iterations of the estimated numbers by the OBR of stamp duty land tax in Scotland. Over the duration of those 3 estimates, from March 2012 to December 2012 to March 2013, over the course of one calendar year, there has been a reduction in their estimates in 2016-17 of 15%. That's a very significant variation in the estimates that the OBR have put forward. So I think it's important that when we come to agree the block grant adjustment mechanism, we do that on the basis that I have suggested to the committee is the appropriate mechanism, which is to take an average of 5 years of actual receipts under stamp duty land tax in advance of the conclusion of the application of land and buildings transaction tax in April 2015. Now, the final point I would like to make, Presiding Officer, is back to the question of the historic occasion that we have witnessed today of the Parliament taking decisions to legislate for taxation. Marco Biagi made a very strong contribution, as did John Mason, making the point that Parliament today is essentially embracing, from the support of the Labour Party, the support of the Conservatives and the Liberals and our other colleagues, to take a different course on this particular tax. And we're doing that because we think this is right in the Scottish interest. It should be the approach that we're taking in the interests of the people that we represent. And Marco Biagi and John Mason made the point that if we do that on land and buildings transaction tax, why on earth should we not do it on a whole range of other responsibilities where we could take decisions that suited the needs and the interests of the people of Scotland, which are currently not in our responsibility to undertake. And Mr Biagi made the point, or posed the question, why has stamp duty remained as it is for so long? Well, it's remained as it is for so long because we've not had the opportunity to design a system that is in the interests of people in Scotland and meets their needs. The manner of how Parliament has gone about the scrutiny and the consideration of this bill so far is something of which I think we should all be proud across the political spectrum. Mr Stevenson said that today demonstrated that Parliament has as yet untapped competence and talent to resolve issues of taxation responsibilities. And I think that's an important signal to us that there is much more we could do to exercise wider responsibilities, because the capability, the talent, the capacity for scrutiny, the capacity to design solutions that are in the interests of the people of Scotland lie in this Parliament, and we should take that aspiration as we look forward to acquiring more powers as part of the completion of our constitutional journey and the successful outcome of the referendum in 2014, when the Parliament will be able to complete its powers and exercise the full range of responsibilities in the interests of the people that we have the privilege to represent.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on Stage 1 of the Land and Buildings Translation Tax Scotland Bill, and it is now time to move to decision time. And there is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion S4M 06294, in the name of John Swinney, on the Land and Buildings Translation Tax Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to, and that concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting.